rejection mark burned on Lena Ashwood's wrist before she had fully understood what was happening. She had stood at the center of the Silverstone Pack's bonding circle, with her hands folded neatly in front of her, her white dress pressed and clean, her dark hair braided back the way her mother had taught her, before her mother stopped having reasons to teach her anything. The grass under her bare feet was damp. She could feel the collective weight of 300 pack members standing around her in a ring, and she could hear the low, anticipatory murmur that moved through them like wind through dry leaves. She could not see any of it. She had not been able to see anything for 6 years. But she could feel things with a precision that most people in the Silverstone Pack had never bothered to understand. She could feel the moment Nathan Cole, the Pack's beta and her assigned mate of 3 years, stepped into the circle and stopped 4 feet away from her instead of 2. She could feel the gap in the air between them, the deliberate distance of a man who had already made up his mind before he put on his ceremony clothes that morning. She could hear the change in his breathing, the way it was too steady, too controlled, like someone who had rehearsed what they were going to say, until it stopped sounding like cruelty and started sounding like logistics. She had told herself, on the walk down from the Omega quarters to the bonding field, that she was prepared for this. She had known for a long time that Nathan did not love her. She had suspected for almost as long that love was not really the point. Mates in the Silverstone Pack were assigned by the Alpha Council based on bloodline compatibility and what the elders called pack benefit. Lena's bloodline was considered weak. Her condition, as the elders had always called her blindness, was considered a liability. The only reason she had been assigned a mate at all was that Nathan had needed something from the arrangement, and that something had nothing to do with Lena specifically. She had not known what that something was. She had spent 3 years trying not to wonder. Now, standing in the circle with the cold morning pressing against her bare arms, and Nathan's controlled breathing 4 feet away, and 300 pack members watching in silence, she finally understood that it did not matter. He spoke loudly enough for the entire circle to hear. That was the first thing that told her how this was going to go. A man who still had some kindness left in him would have spoken quietly, even if the outcome was the same. Nathan spoke at a volume that suggested he wanted witnesses. He said that after 3 years of consideration, he was formally dissolving the assigned bond between himself and the Omega, designated as Lena Ashwood. He said that the grounds were incompatibility, insufficient pack contribution, and physical limitation. He said the words in a flat, practiced voice, the way someone reads a list of charges, rather than the way someone speaks about a person they have shared 3 years of mornings with. The rejection mark appeared on her wrist the moment he finished speaking. She felt it like a brand pressed briefly against her skin. Not painful exactly, but deeply unpleasant in the way that only things involving the soul tend to be. A sensation of something closing, a door, sealed from the outside. She did not make a sound. There was a long silence in the bonding circle. Then Nathan's footsteps moved away from her, back toward the standing ring of pack members, and the sound of his retreat was absorbed by the crowd, the way a stone disappears into still water. The elder coordinator, a woman named Merritt who had officiated every bonding and rejection ceremony in the Silverstone Pack for 30 years, stepped into the circle. Lena could recognize Merritt by the click of her walking stick and the smell of the dried herbs she kept in the pocket of her ceremony robe. Merritt said, in a voice that carried no warmth and no apology, that the rejection had been formally witnessed and recorded. She said that under pack law, an Omega who had been rejected and carried the rejection mark was classified as unbonded and was therefore required to relinquish her place in the pack's communal housing. She said this as if she were explaining the rules of a game Lena had never agreed to play. Lena said nothing. She was counting, very quietly, in the back of her mind, not counting down to anything specific, just counting, because it was something to do with the part of her brain that would otherwise be spinning out of control. Merritt told her she had until midday to collect her belongings from the Omega quarters. She told her that the pack would provide her with enough food for 2 days of travel. She told her that the southern boundary of pack territory was approximately 4 miles from the bonding field, and that Lena was expected to be on the other side of it before nightfall. Then Merritt walked away. 300 people stood around Lena in a ring, and not one of them spoke to her. Not one of them stepped forward. Not one of them said her name. She walked back to the Omega quarters by herself. She had been walking that path for 6 years without anyone's help, and she walked it now the same way she always had, counting steps between landmarks, trailing her fingertips along the stone wall that ran beside the northern path, feeling the slight dip in the ground that meant she was 12 steps from the entrance. She walked steadily. She did not trip. She did not hesitate. She went to her room, which she had shared with 2 other Omega women for the past 4 years, and she packed everything she owned into a single canvas bag. She owned a change of clothes, a second pair of shoes that were slightly too small but functional, a wool blanket that she had worn to threads on one corner from too many cold nights, a small tin box that held a packet of dried herbs, a folding knife that had belonged to her father, and a leather-bound journal that she could not read anymore, but still kept because of the weight of it in her hands. She left the room without saying goodbye to anyone, because neither of her 2 roommates had come back from the bonding ceremony yet, and she was quietly grateful for that. She did not want to manage anyone else's discomfort while she was managing her own. The pack elder had left a cloth sack outside her door. She found it by nearly tripping over it and caught herself against the doorframe with one hand. She picked up the sack, felt through the outside of it to assess its contents, and identified 2 bread rolls, something wrapped in paper that smelled like dried meat, a small skin of water, and what felt like a handful of dried fruit. 2 days of food, as promised. Barely enough for 2 days, but enough. She added it to her canvas bag, put the bag over her shoulder, and walked toward the southern boundary. The day was fully underway by the time she crossed the line of marked stones that indicated the edge of Silverstone territory. She could tell by the position of the sun on her face. She turned south, as she had been directed, and she kept walking. She did not think about Nathan. She had stopped letting herself think about Nathan quite a while ago. What she thought about, instead, was the ground under her feet. She was wearing her good shoes, not the ones that were too small, and she was grateful for that practical decision. The ground on the other side of the boundary line was different from the packed earth of pack paths. It was looser, more irregular, full of small stones and the soft depressions left by animal tracks. She adjusted her gait automatically, shortening her steps, placing her feet more deliberately, giving herself slightly more time on each footfall to assess the stability of the ground beneath her. She carried her walking stick loosely in her right hand. It was a simple wooden staff, slightly taller than she was, worn smooth at the grip from years of use. She did not swing it dramatically the way people in stories always seem to imagine blind people walked with their canes. She used it as an extension of her reach, tapping lightly ahead of her to check for obstacles, drawing information from the resistance and sound that came back up through the wood. The forest closed in around her after the first mile. She could tell by the way the wind dropped and the temperature fell, and the sounds around her became more layered and complex. The birdsong changed character. The ground changed from open grass to a surface scattered with fallen leaves and occasional roots. She navigated through it carefully, not quickly, and she did not panic. Panic was a luxury she had learned to set aside a long time ago. The 2 bread rolls lasted her through the first afternoon. She ate them slowly, not because she was trying to ration them, but because eating slowly made the time feel more managed, and managing time was one of the many skills that living inside her own head had taught her. She drank from the water skin sparingly. She did not know where the nearest water source was, and she had learned years ago that the worst mistake a person could make in an unknown environment was to use their resources before they had a plan for replacing them. She found a place to sleep that first night by following sound. There was a cluster of rocks off to her left that she could detect by the way the ambient noise of the forest bounced slightly differently off a hard surface than it did off open air. She found the rocks by walking toward that difference in the sound, and she found a hollow between 2 of them that was large enough to sit in and deep enough to offer some protection from the wind. She wrapped herself in the wool blanket and sat with her back against the rock and did not sleep for a long time. She lay there listening to the forest. The forest was not quiet. Most people seemed to think silence was the absence of sound, but she had learned that true quiet was actually a very specific kind of noise, a settled, layered hum that had nothing urgent in it. The forest at night was full of urgency. Creatures moving through underbrush, the distant sound of water, which she filed away carefully as directional information for morning, the wind in the canopy above her making a sound that was softer and higher than wind through open grass. She thought about the rejection mark on her wrist. She didn't touch it. She knew exactly what it felt like already, because she had felt it being put there, and feeling it again seemed like a choice she did not need to make tonight. She thought about the elder coordinator's voice, the complete flatness of it. Merritt had been in the pack her entire life. She had supervised Lena's assignment to the Omega quarters when Lena was 17 and her sight was still fading. She had been present at the medical assessment when the PAX healer had formally noted that Lena's blindness was total and permanent. She had been present at the assignment ceremony when Nathan's name had been paired with Lena's on the bonding list. She had managed all of it with the same flat efficiency she had brought to the rejection ceremony this morning, and Lena could not tell, even now, whether that flatness was cruelty or just the natural result of doing something for so long that it stopped being about people at all. She decided it didn't matter. What merit was or was not did not change where Lena was sitting. She fell asleep sometime in the early hours of morning, when the forest sounds had settled into their deepest register, and the temperature had dropped to the point where staying awake felt like more effort than sleep. She woke when the birds changed their tone, which was how she had always woken since losing her sight, because the birds' morning sounds were as reliable as any clock, and considerably more honest. She stood, stretched her back carefully against the rock, and reorganized her bag by feel. She drank a small amount of water. She ate the dried fruit, which was chewy and slightly too sweet, and 2 pieces of the dried meat, which was salty and helped with the thirst. Then she oriented herself toward the sound of the water she had heard in the night, and she walked toward it. The creek was smaller than she had hoped, and larger than she had feared. She found it by following its sound down a gentle slope, and she stepped into it up to her ankles to verify it was moving water before she allowed herself to drink from it. Moving water was not safe, not reliably, but it was considerably safer than standing water, and right now, safe enough was the best she was going to manage. She refilled the water skin and kept moving south. The second day was harder than the first. Her ankle, which she had twisted slightly on the walk out of pack territory, had stiffened overnight and was making itself known on every uneven footfall. She adjusted her walking pattern to compensate, adding more weight to her staff on that side, but it slowed her down. She did not like being slowed down. Being slow in an environment she didn't know was the kind of thing that turned manageable situations into difficult ones. She spent much of the second day simply listening, not for anything specific. Listening the way she always listened when she was in an unfamiliar place, building a picture of the space around her from its sounds and temperatures, and the way the air moved. The forest was thinning, she thought. The canopy above her was less complete. More direct sun reached her face, which was useful for direction and uncomfortable for walking. She finished the last of the food at midday on the second day. She had made it last slightly longer than she had expected to, and she allowed herself a small moment of satisfaction about that before moving on. By late afternoon of the second day, she had found another water source, a larger one this time, and had refilled the skin again. She had also found something that might have been a path, or might simply have been a clearing made by animal movement, but in either case it offered easier footing than the surrounding forest floor, and she followed it. It was on this path, in the late afternoon of the second day, that she first heard the sound that told her she was no longer alone. It was not a dramatic sound, not the crack of a branch under a heavy foot or the rustle of something large in the underbrush. It was quieter than that. It was the almost absence of certain sounds, the way the birds in a particular direction had stopped singing, and the way the ambient hum of the forest had shifted very slightly in quality, as if a presence had entered it that the forest itself had noticed. She stopped walking. She stood still, and she listened. The presence was to her right and slightly behind her, maybe 20 feet back. It was moving, but moving carefully, which told her it was either an animal that had caught her scent and was tracking her with intention, or a person trying not to be heard. She had been followed by animals before, and she knew what that felt like. This did not feel like that. She kept walking. She did not change her pace. She did not look in the direction of the sound, because looking was not something she did, and because even if she could have, maintaining an unchanged pattern of movement was more useful than any reaction. The presence followed her for about 10 minutes, then it stopped. She did not know what to do with that, so she filed it away and kept walking. She made camp that night beside a large tree, whose roots had created a hollow at the base, just large enough to wedge herself into. She sat with her back against the tree and her blanket around her shoulders, and she thought about the third day. On the third day, she found the berries. She found them by smell, a faint sweetness that was distinct from the general organic smell of the forest floor, and she dropped to her knees and felt carefully through the undergrowth, until her fingers found the small, round shapes of them clustered on a low vine. She had some knowledge of edible plants from her years in the pack, where the Omega women were responsible for the kitchen garden and the preservation of foraged herbs. But her knowledge was patchy, and she was aware that it was patchy. She held one of the berries between her fingers, and she made the kind of decision that could only be made when the alternative was worse. She ate 3 of them. Then she waited 20 minutes to see what happened to her. Nothing happened. She ate more. They were not enough. They were sweet, and they gave her a brief lift of energy that faded faster than she would have liked. But they were something, and something was what she had. By the evening of the 3rd day, she was genuinely tired in the deep, molecular way that comes from insufficient food and too much physical effort, and her ankle had moved past stiffness into something that felt closer to a sustained complaint. She was walking more slowly than she wanted to. She was thinking less clearly than she preferred. She sat down on a fallen log to rest her ankle, and she tried to think practically about her situation. She had been walking roughly south, as far as she could judge from the sun's position. She did not know exactly where she was. She knew that south of Silverstone territory, there were 3 things, according to what she had been able to piece together from conversations she'd overheard in the pack over the years. There were the neutral borderlands, which were technically not claimed by any pack or territory. There was a small settlement of unmated wolves about 40 miles south, though she was not certain of the exact distance. And there was the boundary of the Ironvale Kingdom, the territory ruled by the Alpha King, which began somewhere in the southern stretch of the borderlands. She had not particularly thought about the Ironvale Kingdom when she had been walking. It had not seemed immediately relevant, but sitting now on the fallen log with her ankle aching, and her food supply entirely exhausted, and her water skin down to the last third, she thought about it. The Ironvale Kingdom had a reputation that she had absorbed through years of pack conversations and pack stories, and the particular way adults' voices changed when they talked about certain things. King Cale Drace was spoken of with the careful flatness that people use when they want to talk about something without appearing to be afraid of it. He had ruled the Ironvale Kingdom for 11 years. He had, in those 11 years, expanded its borders, strengthened its alliances, and made its army one of the most disciplined on the continent. He had also, by most accounts, become progressively harder to be near. The word that people used, when they were being precise about it, was ruthless. They meant it as a warning. She sat with this information, and she thought about it honestly. She was a blind, rejected Omega, alone in the borderlands with no food and half a skin of water, and an ankle that was considering not cooperating for much longer. The idea of walking into the territory of a ruthless Alpha King seemed, on its face, like a poor choice. The alternative was to keep walking through empty borderlands with no supplies and hope for the best. She stood up, adjusted her bag, and kept walking south. It was not a choice she made with confidence, but it was the choice she made with the information she had, and she had long since learned that the right decision and the comfortable decision were not always the same thing. The 4th morning came, and she was still walking. She was tired, in a way that had gone past the kind of tired that sleep fixes and into the kind of tired that is really about something deeper. The accumulated weight of 3 days of being entirely alone in a space that offered no concessions to her presence. She walked more slowly than on the first day. Her steps were less precise, her staff work less automatic, her attention more narrowly focused on the immediate problem of putting one foot in front of the other, without doing anything her ankle would not forgive. She did not know exactly when she crossed the boundary into Ironvale territory. There were no marked stones here, no ceremony, no elder with a walking stick to inform her of the transition. The forest simply continued. The path simply continued. The sound of her own footsteps continued. What changed was the quality of the quiet ahead of her. She had been tracking the sound of the forest for 3 days, and she had become fluent in its particular language. The way it thinned in the late morning, the way it thickened at dusk, the way large presences moved through it, and the way small ones did. She had stopped flinching at most of what the forest said to her, and had started simply hearing it. The quiet ahead of her was not the forest's usual kind of quiet. It was the kind of quiet that has people in it. She kept walking, because stopping now seemed more dangerous than continuing. She adjusted her grip on the staff. She straightened her posture slightly, not out of pride exactly, but because she had learned a long time ago that the way a person carries their body communicates something, even to people who could not see their face, and she wanted to communicate a person who was walking somewhere with purpose, rather than a person who was exhausted and afraid, even though both of those things were true. She heard them before she ran into him. Or rather, she almost didn't hear him, which was the thing that told her he was something unusual. Most people made more noise than they thought they did. Even people who were trying to be quiet made noise. Small adjustments of weight and breath and cloth that built up into a detectable presence in the air around them. This man was quieter than almost anyone she had ever encountered. She caught him only because she had been walking with maximum attention for 3 days, and she was very good at catching things. She had about 2 seconds of knowing that there was something directly in her path before she walked into him. It was like walking into a wall. She hit him full in the chest, rebounded hard enough to stagger back 2 steps, and would have gone down entirely if she had not already had her staff planted in front of her. She caught herself on it, one hand gripping the wood, her other hand out for balance, and she stood there for a moment, breathing. The wall had not moved. At all. She had collided with people before. Everyone's body reacted to unexpected contact, the instinctive adjustment of weight, the small step backward, the intake of breath. This man had done none of those things. He had absorbed the full impact of her walking into him, and had not shifted by so much as an inch in any direction. She said, "You are standing in the middle of a path." She meant it as an observation, not an accusation, but she was aware, even as she said it, that her voice was probably sharper than was wise, given that she had just walked into a man she could not see, in a forest that might belong to someone who could have her removed from it without much effort. The man did not answer. She could hear his breathing, which was completely even, not slowed down to signal calm, just genuinely unhurried, the breathing of someone for whom encountering a woman who walked into him on a forest path was apparently not a significant disruption. She heard other breathing around her, not just his. Multiple presences, distributed in a rough arc at distances ranging from 10 to perhaps 30 feet. She counted the sources without making it obvious she was counting. She reached 5, and stopped, because 5 was enough. She said, more quietly, "I apologize for the collision. I didn't hear you until I was already on top of you, and by that point the math had already resolved." There was a pause. Then, from somewhere to her left, she heard the movement of metal, not loud, not dramatic, but the specific sound of metal being drawn or readied in a way that was unmistakably purposeful. The man directly in front of her said one word, "Stop." His voice was very low and very even. It was the voice of someone who had spent so long not raising it, that the quietness of it had become, in itself, a form of authority. The metal sound stopped. He was, she understood immediately, a man whose people obeyed him without hesitation. She filed that information carefully. He said, "You're on the wrong side of a boundary." She said, "I'm aware of that. I was on the right side of a boundary 3 days ago. Circumstances changed." Another silence. She could not tell what he was thinking, because she had no face to read, and his voice gave almost nothing away. She stood still, and she waited. He said, "Who are you?" She said, "Lena Ashwood. Previously of the Silverstone Pack, currently not of it." He said, "Why?" She said, "That's a personal question to ask someone you've known for 30 seconds. Behind her, she heard a sound that might have been someone trying to smother a laugh. The man in front of her was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, she thought, though she was not certain, that the very beginning of his next sentence was fractionally slower than the ones before it, as if something had shifted, just slightly, in the quality of his attention. He said, "You're going to come with us." She said, "Where?" He said, "My keep." She thought about this for approximately 2 seconds. She thought about the alternative, which was the empty borderlands behind her, and the nothing ahead of her, and the fact that she had not eaten in a day and a half. She said, "All right." She heard him begin to walk, and she fell into step beside him, matching his pace by the sound of his footsteps, adjusting when he adjusted, not asking for guidance, and not being given any. She did not know, walking beside him through the afternoon forest with her staff tapping lightly against the ground, and 5 pairs of unseen footsteps moving around them, that she had just walked into the most significant chapter of her life. She was thinking mainly about whether there would be food at this keep, and whether her ankle was going to cooperate for the remainder of the walk. She was also thinking, in the very back of her mind, behind the practical calculations and the careful listening, about the fact that his voice had been quiet in a way that was different from the flat quiet of people who had decided she was not worth the effort of warmth. His quiet was something else. She did not know what to call it yet. She kept walking. The keep emerged from the sound, before it emerged from anything else. She heard it the way she heard all large things, as an absence of the ambient noise of open air, a dense, settled mass of stone that altered the way sound traveled in every direction around it. She heard gates, not just the visual gates of a large structure, but the audible ones, the way a contained space has a different acoustic quality than an open one. She heard water somewhere, a fountain or a cistern, the specific rhythm of managed water rather than natural water. She heard, faintly, voices at a distance, and the sound of work being done. The man beside her had not spoken again during the walk. His people had not spoken either. They had moved through the forest in a silence that she now understood was habitual rather than hostile, the silence of people who had been trained to move without announcing themselves. He stopped, and she stopped with him. He said, "There are 3 steps up at the gate, then a courtyard, then stairs to the main hall." She stood for a moment with that information. He had told her. She had not asked. He had looked at the entrance to his keep and considered how she would navigate it, and told her what she needed to know without being asked to. She said, "Thank you." She felt the 3 steps up with her staff, and climbed them without difficulty. She found the courtyard by the way the acoustics opened, and she counted the crossing of it. She found the stairs to the main hall by following his footsteps, which were slightly ahead of her, and she climbed them with her hand trailing lightly along the stone wall on her left side. She had no idea what the keep looked like. She had a growing sense of its shape, its sounds, its temperatures, the way wood and stone and height create specific environments that can be felt as well as seen. But she had no picture. She was very hungry. She was also, in a way that she was being careful not to examine too closely, deeply, unreasonably curious about the man who had walked her here without asking her to explain herself, and had told her about the steps without being asked. She went where the footsteps led her. That was all she could do. And it was, she supposed, exactly what she had been doing for the last 4 days. The main hall of Ironvale Keep smelled like stone and cedar, and something Lena could not immediately name. Something that reminded her of a fire that had burned long enough to stop being dramatic about it, and start being warm. She stood in the entrance with her canvas bag over one shoulder and her staff in her right hand, and she listened to the hall assemble itself around her. High ceilings, she thought, not because she could see them, but because the sound that came back to her from above was the sound of a lot of empty vertical space, the way an echo differs when it has more room to climb. Old stone floors. The footsteps of the people who had walked in ahead of her made that particular flat, decisive sound that comes from weight meeting dense, settled rock. One door open on her left side, approximately 12 feet away. Another sound somewhere ahead, the creak of a chair or a bench, the movement of someone who had been sitting and had stood. The man who had walked her here stopped walking. Everyone around her stopped. A voice came from ahead of her, from the direction of the creek, and this voice was female and fully awake, and radiating a kind of focused wariness that Lena could hear in the tightening of every syllable. The voice said, "My lord." The man beside Lena said, "She's a guest." The female voice said, "She's an Omega, from outside the territory." He said, "I said guest." There was a silence. It was the kind of silence that happens when people who are trained to obey encounter something they do not fully understand and choose obedience over understanding. Then the woman said, "Of course. Should I have a room prepared?" He said, "And food." Another beat of silence, shorter this time. The woman said, "Yes, my lord." Lena heard footsteps moving away, efficient and precise, the footsteps of someone who did not waste motion. She heard the man beside her turn, and his footsteps moved toward the center of the room, and then stopped. He said, "Sit down if you'd like." She said, "Where?" He said, "Bench on your left, 2 steps, and then 4 feet of open space." She found it exactly where he said it would be. She sat down, and placed her bag between her feet and her staff across her knees, and she let out, very quietly, a breath that had been waiting longer than she had realized. The room was not quiet. There were people in it, at least 4 that she could identify by their breathing and the tiny sounds of bodies in a space, the adjustment of weight, the shift of cloth. She thought there might be more standing near the entrance. She could feel the quality of their attention on her in the way that had nothing to do with sight, the particular awareness that comes from being the most interesting thing in a room. She said, not loudly, "I understand this is unusual." Nobody answered her. She said, "I'm not asking for anything beyond a meal and a direction. I don't know exactly where I am, and I don't know what the nearest settlement to the south is. If someone could tell me those 2 things, I'll be grateful, and I'll be on my way." From the direction where she had last heard the man's footsteps, his voice came back to her. He said, "You've been walking for 3 days." She said, "Yes." He said, "Alone?" She said, "Obviously yes." Another pause. She wondered, in a distant, analytical way, whether he was looking at her the way people often did when they first encountered her, and were trying to reconcile what they were seeing with what they had expected. She had no idea what she looked like at this moment, but she could make some educated guesses. She had been walking through a forest for 3 days, with inadequate food and insufficient sleep. She doubted she looked particularly composed, though she was doing her best. He said, "Why did they leave you?" She said, "They didn't leave me. They made a decision and I walked away from the consequences of it. Those are different things." She could hear, very faintly, someone across the room shift their weight. It might have been surprise. It might have been something else. The woman who had spoken earlier returned. She came from the direction of the left door, and she had others with her. Lena could tell by the rhythm of footsteps. At least 2 more people. She heard the sound of something being set down, the gentle impact of a tray or a platter on a hard surface, and then the smell of food reached her, and she had to work, actively, to control her reaction to it. Bread. Hot bread. The yeasty, dense smell of bread that was still warm from an oven. And something else, soup or broth, the complex smell of meat and vegetables and herbs that had been simmering long enough to become something more than the sum of their parts. The woman said, "It's on the table to your right." Lena said, "Thank you." She stood, took 2 careful steps to her right, found the edge of the table with her hand, set down her staff, and located the bowl by the warmth coming off it, before her fingers made contact with the rim. She sat in the chair behind the table, because she had already located it with the back of her knee, and she ate. She ate carefully, not because she was performing composure, but because eating too quickly after inadequate food was its own problem, and she was aware enough of her body to know that. She ate the bread in small pieces, dipped in the broth. She ate the broth with the spoon she found on the right side of the bowl. She was aware that the room was still full of people, and that most of them were still looking at her, but she had spent most of her life being looked at by people who found her interesting, for reasons she did not choose, and she had made her peace with it. She finished the bread and most of the broth. There was something else on the tray, something that felt like sliced fruit, and she ate some of that too. Then she set down the spoon and sat back and thought. The man had not spoken again while she ate. She found this interesting. In her experience, people who had power tended to want to demonstrate it by filling silences. This man seemed comfortable with silence, in a way that was not passive. He was quiet, the way something dense is quiet. Not emptily, but with a weight. She said, "Thank you for the food." He said, "You said you didn't know where you were." She said, "I still don't." He said, "You're in Ironvale territory. My name is Cale Drace." She had already suspected as much. She acknowledged it, with a nod, rather than expressing surprise she did not entirely feel. She said, "I'd heard of you." He said, "What had you heard?" She thought about honesty versus tact, and decided that tact was probably less useful in this specific situation. She said, "That you're effective and difficult." The room was very quiet for a moment. Then she heard, from different parts of the room, sounds that she was fairly certain were people attempting not to react in ways that would be noticed. The woman who had brought the food made a sound that might have been a very controlled exhale. Cale Drace said, "Accurate." He said it without inflection. She could not tell if he was amused or annoyed or neither. She suspected, based on everything she had heard from him so far, that he was probably not particularly troubled by her assessment. He said, "You'll stay tonight." She said, "I don't want to be a problem." He said, "You're already something I'm going to have to explain to my advisors. Whether you stay tonight or not is a separate question. She considered that. It was honest, which she appreciated. Most people, when they were going to do something on her behalf, dressed it up as generosity. He had framed it as a logistical reality, which was more accurate and considerably less exhausting. She said, "All right?" The woman, whose name she still did not know, showed her to a room. She was a compact person, quick-moving, with the kind of controlled presence that suggested she had been managing difficult things for a long time. She walked just ahead of Lena and said, without being asked, "Left turn here, door at the end of this hallway. The room has a window on the east wall." Lena said, "Which way does it face?" The woman said, "East." Lena said, "Does it get morning sun?" The woman paused for just a moment, the way people pause when they're accessing a memory that was there all along, but they'd never had occasion to retrieve before. She said, "Yes. From about an hour after dawn through mid-morning." Lena said, "Good." She said it plainly, meaning it. Morning sun was not an indulgence. It was a reliable piece of daily information. Orientation, time of day, a warmth on her skin that told her something real about where she was in the world. She had always organized her mornings around it. The woman opened the door to the room, and Lena walked in and began, immediately and methodically, to map it. This was something she had always done in any new space, and something she had gotten very fast at. She walked the perimeter first, trailing her left hand along the wall, counting her steps. The room was rectangular, not square, approximately 14 feet on the long sides, and 9 feet on the short ones. There was a window in the east wall, as promised, and the slight current of air from it told her it was cracked open, which she appreciated. There was a bed along the south wall, substantial, with a frame that her knuckles brushed at hip height. There was a table against the north wall and a chair beside it. There was a wash basin on a stand near the door, and she confirmed the presence of water in it by the sound when she tapped the side of the basin with one finger. She located all of these things in approximately 4 minutes. Then she went and sat on the edge of the bed, and she set down her bag, and she took off her shoes, and she let herself be, for the first time in 4 days, genuinely still. The woman had stayed in the doorway. She said, "My name is Vera. I'm the keep's head of household. If you need anything tonight, you can call out and someone will hear you. The walls here are stone, and they carry sound." Lena said, "Thank you, Vera." Vera said, "You're welcome." And then she said, with a directness that Lena found she liked immediately, "What happened to your ankle?" Lena said, "I twisted it on the second day. It's not serious." Vera said, "I'll have something sent up for it." She left before Lena could respond, which told Lena that Vera was a woman who made decisions and then implemented them, rather than a woman who made decisions and waited for approval. This was, in Lena's experience, a much more efficient way to operate. She sat in the dark room, because all rooms were dark to her, and she thought about the last 4 days. She thought about the rejection mark on her wrist. She had been aware of it all day in the way you're aware of a bruise. Not constantly, but reliably, always there when you happen to put your attention on it. She touched it now with the tips of 2 fingers. It was a raised mark, just slightly, no larger than a thumbprint, positioned on the inside of her left wrist. The skin around it felt slightly warm. She had heard, growing up in the Silverstone pack, that rejection marks faded over time. Sometimes quickly, sometimes very slowly. She had heard that for some Omegas, the mark never fully disappeared, which the older women in the pack discussed in the hushed tones they reserved for things that were true but inconvenient. She did not spend long thinking about whether hers would fade. It was there now. That was what was true now. What was also true now was that she was in a stone room in the keep of the Ironvale Alpha King. She had eaten hot food for the first time in 4 days, and her ankle was likely about to receive some kind of treatment from a woman who made decisions efficiently. These were, on balance, better circumstances than she had been in 48 hours ago. She heard footsteps in the hallway outside her room. Not Vera, heavier. She recognized, without being entirely certain why, that the weight and rhythm of these footsteps was the same as the weight and rhythm she had been walking beside all afternoon. They slowed as they passed her door. They did not stop. She listened to them continue down the hallway. She listened until the sound resolved into distance, and then into the general ambience of the keep, the nighttime sounds of a large stone building settling into itself. She thought about the fact that he had told her about the 3 steps. She lay down on the bed, still in her traveling clothes, and she pulled the worn blanket from her bag, because old habits were old habits, and the unfamiliar blankets on the keep's bed were not yet hers, and she was not ready for them yet. She lay on her back with the blanket over her, and she listened to the building around her, and she was asleep before she had finished the thought she had started, about whether she would stay more than one night. In the morning, the sun came through the east window exactly as Vera had said it would. Lena was awake before it reached her, because she always woke when the birds changed, and the birds here were different from the forest birds, more varied, the birds of a place that had been cultivated over time rather than simply left to run. But when the sun did reach her, moving across the floor and up onto the bed in the gradual way that direct morning light moves, she turned her face toward it and lay still for a moment with it warm on her closed eyelids. She thought, I am still alive. I am not hungry this morning. My ankle was wrapped during the night by someone who came in quietly while I was asleep, leaving behind the smell of an herbal compress and a bandage that was properly done. She thought, I need to know what I'm going to do next. There was a knock at the door. She said, come in, and heard it open. A young voice, female, said, Vera sent breakfast, ma'am. Lena said, please just call me Lena. The voice said, uncertain but willing, yes. Lena, I'll put it on the table. She said, thank you. What's your name? The voice said, Darcy. She said, Darcy, how long have you worked in the keep? Darcy said, 3 years, ma'am. Sorry. She said, do you like it here? There was a small pause. Darcy said, yes, it's strict, but it's fair. The king doesn't tolerate unkindness between staff. Lena filed this. She said, that's good to know. Darcy put the breakfast things down with a quieter efficiency than she probably knew she was projecting, the practiced quietness of someone who has learned to move carefully around a large, serious household. She said, Lord Kale asked if you would meet him in the record room after breakfast. I can show you where it is. Lena said, yes, please. She ate breakfast with the same methodical care she had brought to dinner the night before, and then she washed her face and hands in the basin, changed into her second set of clothes, which were not significantly better than the first but were not 3 days of forest walking worse, and followed Darcy through a hallway and down a flight of stairs. The record room was on the second floor. She knew it was a record room before Darcy announced it, because she could smell paper, a lot of it. The dry, faintly dusty smell of stored documents in a room that was large enough for the smell to have accumulated significance. Cale Drace was already there. She could tell by the quality of the silence when she entered. He was not a man whose presence was absent. Darcy left with a small sound of retreating footsteps, closing the door behind her. Lena stood in the room and she thought, with some dismay, about the organizational system of the documents it contained. She could tell by the way sound moved through the room that there were shelves on at least 3 walls, and the paper smell told her those shelves were full. The room smelled like a place where information had been stored without adequate categorization for a long time. She said, you have a great deal of paperwork. He said, yes. She said, how is it organized? He said, by date received. She said, by date received. He said, yes. She turned the phrase over in her mind. She said, that is not an organizational system. That is a record of the order in which things arrived, which is only useful if the thing you're looking for is the most recent item, and only if you can also see the date. There was a pause. He said, 3 of my scribes organize it. She said, 3 scribes organized it by date received. He said, yes. She said, why? He said, because that's the system I inherited when I took rule. She said, and in 11 years, no one suggested changing it. He said, you've been here one morning. She said, I know, I'm just asking. The silence that followed this was not hostile. It was thoughtful, she thought. Or at least it was not the silence of someone who was deciding whether to be offended. It was the silence of someone who was considering something. He said, why are you asking about the records? She said, because I worked in the administration of the Silverstone Pack for 3 years. I cataloged everything the Pack Omega quarters produced in terms of goods, herbal medicine, and food processing. I organized the trade logs for 6 seasons. I know what a record system looks like when it works, and what it looks like when it doesn't. He said, you can't see the records. She said, I know that. I'm offering context, not my services. Another pause. He said, "You're offering your services." She said, "I was being polite." The silence that followed this one had a different quality. She was beginning to understand the particular texture of his silences, the way some of them were thoughtful, and some were assessing, and some were something she didn't have a word for yet, but was beginning to recognize. He said, "Stay." She said, "For how long?" He said, "Until you've told me everything wrong with my record system." She said, "That could take a while." He said, "I'm aware." She stood in the room with its walls of poorly organized paper, and she thought about the empty borderlands behind her, and the nothing she had been walking toward, and she thought about morning sun on a window that faced east, and bread that was still warm, and a woman named Vera who made decisions efficiently. She said, "All right." He said nothing. She found the nearest shelf by following its paper smell gradient, and she ran her fingers along the edge of the first set of documents there. The edges were rough, uneven, documents of different sizes and weights, stacked without much care. She could already feel, without seeing a single word, the particular chaos of a system that had never been loved by anyone responsible for it. She said, "We're going to need a different approach." He said, "We." She said, "You and your 3 scribes. And me, until I decide otherwise." The silence that followed lasted several seconds. Then she heard him move, not toward her, but to the other side of the room, and the sound of a chair being pulled out, and then the sound of a man sitting down and picking up something from the desk in front of him. Working sounds, the sounds of a man who had accepted a development and moved on to the next thing. She thought, "I am going to stay in this keep for a while." She was not certain how she felt about that. She thought she felt something in the region of cautious. She turned back to the shelf, and she began to think about reorganization. Ironvale Keep had 47 rooms, 6 staircases, 3 internal courtyards, 1 great hall, 1 record room, and 1 kitchen that Lena had unofficially decided was the best room in the building. She knew all of this because she had mapped the entire keep over the course of her first 4 days in it. She had not been asked to do this. She had not announced that she was doing it. She had simply woken each morning, eaten breakfast, worked in the record room until midday, eaten something from the kitchen, and then used the afternoon to move through a different section of the keep, walking its perimeters, counting its steps, identifying its acoustic qualities and its air currents, and the way its sounds changed with the time of day. By the end of the 4th day, she could move through any part of the keep she had access to, with approximately the same ease she moved through the record room, which was to say, competently and without assistance. The kitchen had become her favorite room, not because of the food, though the food was genuinely excellent, but because the head cook, a man named Owen, was one of the few people in the keep who had stopped finding her interesting within about 20 minutes of their first meeting. He was 63 years old, and had been cooking in this building for 31 of those years, and he had developed, through long experience, a reliable immunity to anything that could be reasonably categorized as unusual. The blind woman who navigated his kitchen without help and asked very specific questions about the provenance of herbs was unusual, yes. But Owen had cooked for a king who woke at irregular hours and once spent 6 months eating nothing but 2 specific foods for reasons he refused to explain. And Owen had made peace with unusual a long time ago. He talked to her while he worked, not about anything significant, about the herbs he used and where they came from, and which ones were unreliable in winter, about the kitchen garden on the eastern side of the keep, which he maintained with the methodical devotion of a man who had decided long ago that a good garden was one of the most reliable forms of peace available, about the difference between 2 types of bread he made on alternating days, and why the distinction mattered to him, even if it was invisible to most of the people who ate them. She listened to him, and asked questions that were occasionally so specific they surprised him, and they had developed, without either of them planning it, a routine. What she had not developed, in those first 4 days, was any clear sense of what the rest of the keep thought of her. She could piece together something from the sounds around her, the way conversations sometimes stopped when she entered a room and resumed when she left, the way certain footsteps gave her a wide berth in the hallways without being obvious about it, the way some members of the household staff spoke to her with the particular over-articulated care of people who were not sure whether her blindness extended to her hearing in some way they did not understand, and the way others spoke to her in the flat, minimal way of people who had been told to be civil and were technically managing it. Vera was not in either of those categories. Vera spoke to her the way Vera spoke to everyone, which was efficiently and without decoration. Lena had come to understand, after 4 days, that this was the highest form of respect Vera offered to anyone, because people Vera did not respect received either elaborate courtesy or deliberate absence, and Lena had received neither. Darcy, the young household worker, had evolved from careful to genuinely warm in the span of 3 days. She had a tendency to narrate small details of the visual environment to Lena that Lena had not asked for, but found she did not mind, because Darcy did it without the self-congratulatory quality some people brought to their helpfulness, the performance of generosity that was really about the helper rather than the helped. Darcy said things like, "The courtyard has flowers coming up in the south corner, the red ones, they came early this year," and offered this as simple information rather than as evidence of her own thoughtfulness. And then there was Cale Drace, who Lena had not yet figured out, and was, she admitted to herself, on the 4th evening while sitting in the record room, organizing trade documents, actively trying to figure out. He came to the record room every morning, not always first thing, sometimes not until the middle of the morning, but reliably, every day, he came. He sat at his desk, which was on the east side of the room, and he worked through whatever documents his advisors brought him. He did not speak very much. She did not speak very much. They existed in the same room for several hours each day, in a silence that was, she thought, more comfortable than it had any right to be given that she had been there less than a week. He had not told her to stay within certain rooms or avoid certain areas. He had not assigned anyone to manage her movements or watch her. She was not confined. She was not supervised. She was, as far as she could tell, genuinely a guest, in the old sense of the word, a person in the house who was treated with the basic dignity due to someone under the roof. She had not experienced this in the Silverstone Pack. In the Silverstone Pack, she had been managed, accommodated, in the language of the official Pack Omega protocols, which was the formal word for the system of careful, never quite hostile adjustments that surrounded a blind Pack member. She had understood the accommodation for what it was, an acknowledgement that she required something different from the standard system, delivered without warmth and without the actual belief that she was someone worth the adjustment. She had been accommodated in the way a building is accommodated when it has an inconvenient wall. The wall is worked around, not resented exactly, but not particularly loved either. In the Ironvale Keep, no one was accommodating her. They were simply behaving in accordance with what she actually needed, and the distinction, though subtle, was the difference between being managed and being treated normally. On the 5th morning, the comfortable version of things changed. She heard the new voice before she heard anything else. She was coming down the 2nd-floor hallway toward the stairs after mapping a section of the north wing, and the voice came up from below, from the direction of the Great Hall, and it was loud in the specific way of people who are accustomed to using volume as a statement rather than a necessity. The voice was female, older, and it carried a quality that Lena recognized from the Silverstone Pack elders, the voice of someone who had spent many years making decisions about other people and had never been significantly challenged about it. She could not hear the words clearly from the hallway, but she could hear the tone, and the tone had edges. She kept walking toward the stairs. She was halfway down them when the great hall door opened and the voice came fully into range. The woman said, at a volume that made clear she was aware of the audience present in the hall, "I want to understand what is happening here, because I was told something this morning that I cannot have heard correctly." A pause. Then Vera's voice, level and uninflected, said, "I can explain what the current situation is, Lady Morrow." The woman said, "What I was told is that there is an Omega woman in this keep, an outsider, an unmated Omega who was apparently found wandering in the border territory and brought inside." She paused. "By him," Vera said. "By the king, yes." A longer pause. Lena had reached the bottom of the stairs. She stood there for a moment, not hiding, not retreating, simply thinking about her next move. Lady Morrow said, "And where is she now?" Vera said, "She may be in the record room, or the north wing. She tends to be moving around the keep in the mornings." Lady Morrow said, "Moving around the keep." Vera said, "Yes." Lady Morrow said, "Freely." Vera said, "Yes." Lady Morrow said something else then, in a lower register, and Lena lost the individual words, though she retained the tone, which was the tone of someone who had found a source of grievance they intended to make full use of. Lena walked toward the great hall, because walking away from things was not something she had ever found useful. She found the door by trailing one hand along the wall of the corridor, and she pushed it open and walked in. The hall was large. She knew its dimensions already from her mapping, and she knew its furniture: the long table down the center, the benches on either side, the raised platform at the far end where the head table sat. She knew where the main door was, and where the two side doors were, and where the windows were, because she had learned this hall as carefully as all the others. What she had not known until this moment was that it would contain Lady Morrow. Lady Morrow's breathing was the first thing she clocked, slightly elevated. A person who was managing controlled emotion. She was standing approximately 15 feet away, to the right of the long table. Vera was nearby, closer to the door, in the part of the room where she tended to stand when she was monitoring a situation. And Cale Drace was at the head of the long table. She knew it was him by now, the particular quality of his stillness. The way his presence organized the air around him differently from everyone else's. He was seated, she thought. He had been working at the table when this had begun. Lady Morrow said, addressing no one for a particular moment, "There she is." Lena said, "Good morning." Lady Morrow said, "Do you know who I am?" Lena said, "I don't, actually. I've been here less than a week, and I'm still learning names. You can tell me, or not. Either way works." She heard Vera make a very small sound. She thought it might be the sound of someone choosing not to smile. Lady Morrow said, "My name is Helena Morrow. I was the mother of King Cale's mate, the late Queen Alara. I have lived in this keep for 12 years. I am, in the absence of a living queen, the highest-ranked woman in this household." Lena said, "I see. Thank you for explaining." Lady Morrow said, "Do you understand what it means that you are here?" Lena said, "I understand it differently than you do, probably. From where I'm standing, it means I was found in the border territory without resources. I was brought in, and I've been given a room and food in exchange for helping reorganize the record system. I haven't asked for anything beyond that." Lady Morrow said, "An unmated Omega in the king's household." Lena said, "A guest in the king's household, yes." Lady Morrow said, "You understand how that looks?" Lena said, "I don't spend much time thinking about how things look, but I understand what you're implying, and the implication is not accurate." Lady Morrow was quiet for a moment. Then she said, to the general room, rather than specifically to Lena, "This is not appropriate. It is not appropriate by any standard I can name, and it opens this household to exactly the kind of speculation that has no place here." From the head of the table, Cale Drace spoke. He said, "Are you finished?" His voice was the same as it always was. Even, low, carrying its own weight without apparent effort. Lady Morrow said, "I'm expressing a concern that I have every right to express." He said, "You've expressed it. I heard it. Thank you." Lady Morrow said, "Cale." He said, "Helena." A silence, a different kind of silence from the ones she had been cataloging. This one had history in it. It had the specific texture of two people who had been around each other for long enough that their silences were full of specific references. Lady Morrow said, with a precision that told Lena every word had been chosen, "She should not be here." He said, "She is here." A pause. Lady Morrow said, "She is a rejected Omega." He said, "She is a woman who was found alone in the border territory, and whose ankle was injured, and who has helped my scribes more in 4 days than they have managed to accomplish in 4 months. She is staying until she decides to leave. If you have further concerns, you may bring them to me in my study." It was the longest he had spoken at once in Lena's hearing. It was not loud. It was perfectly calibrated to be clear and final, and the finality in it was not the finality of someone who was trying to end the conversation because it was uncomfortable. It was the finality of someone who had already made the decision and was communicating it. Lady Morrow left the hall. Her footsteps were controlled and even, the footsteps of someone maintaining dignity, and they faded down the corridor and disappeared. Lena stood in the middle of the hall. Cale said, "Come and sit." She went and found the chair nearest the head of the table and sat in it. She placed her hands on the surface of the table. The wood was smooth and cool. Old wood, the kind that has been polished by decades of use. She said, "I'm sorry for causing that." He said, "You didn't cause it." She would have found something. She said, "Has she always been like that?" He said, "No. She was different when Alara was alive." He said his dead mate's name with the practiced ease of someone who has said it enough times that it has stopped being a wound that opens every time. It had settled into something more like a permanent mark, not bleeding, but not gone either. Lena said, "I'll stay out of the Great Hall in the mornings." He said, "That's not necessary." She said, "It's a practical solution to a social problem." He said, "It's also you, adjusting your behavior to accommodate someone who had no right to speak to you the way she did." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "I'm used to adjusting." He said, "I know, I'm asking you not to. Here." She sat with that for a moment. The morning light was coming through the hall's windows. She could feel the warmth of it on the right side of her face, and the hall was full of the sounds of a building that was waking up, distant activity in the kitchens, footsteps on the upper floors, the sound of the courtyard gate opening somewhere outside. She said, "Why?" He said, "Because you're in my keep, and you're under my protection, and I don't operate the way your last pack did." She said, "How do you know how my last pack operated?" He said, "Because you walked out of it alone, into the border territory, with 2 days of food, and a twisted ankle, and you didn't ask anyone for help for 3 days." She said nothing. He said, "People don't do that if the alternative was good." She looked in his direction, which was something she did sometimes in conversation, a gesture that felt natural, even though it communicated nothing visual. She said, "No, they don't." He said, "Eat something." And then, before she could respond, "Darcy left something in the kitchen for you. She was concerned you hadn't had enough this morning." She said, "I had plenty." He said, "She'll be upset if it's not eaten." She said, "That's manipulation." He said, "Yes." She stood and went to find the kitchen and the food that Darcy had left, and as she walked, she was aware of the fact that Cale Drace had just done something that had not been done to her in a very long time, which was to say something in her defense to someone who had power and had not done it for the performance of it, but because he meant it. She thought about this while Owen talked to her about the herb garden, and she ate the breakfast that Darcy had left, and pretended not to notice that Darcy had also left a small cloth-wrapped piece of honey cake beside it, which was not part of the morning meals, and which was entirely excessive, and which was also, she decided, eating it, very good. The afternoon brought her the next new thing. She was in the record room, working through the third shelf of trade documents with one of Cale's 3 scribes, a young man named Simon who had initially been deeply unsettled by her, and had evolved into being deeply curious about her instead, which was a more productive place for them to be. She was directing him to sort the documents into categories she had identified from handling them, by region rather than by date, by subject, by the year of origin, and she was explaining the logic of the system as she went in the patient, specific way she used when she was teaching something. She heard them in the hallway before the door opened, multiple footsteps, several people, moving with the coordinated purpose of a group that had somewhere to be. The door opened, and Cale came in. She recognized his step. Behind him were at least 3 others. He said, "I need to interrupt for a moment." She said, "Of course." He said, "These are members of my council. They're going to have questions." She heard, behind him, the sounds of the council members arranging themselves in the room. She could identify, from their breathing and their positions, 4 people, 3 men and 1 woman. One of the men spoke. He had the voice of someone accustomed to leading conversations. He said, "You're the Omega woman." She said, "Yes." He said, "From Silverstone Pack." She said, "Formerly, yes." He said, "You were rejected." She said, "Yes." He said, "And now you're here." She said, "Clearly." He said, "Our concern is that an unmated Omega in the king's household represents a vulnerability, both politically and practically." She said, "To whom?" He said, "To the king." She said, "In what way?" He said, "The way that Omegas always represent vulnerabilities in the households of unmated alphas. There are protocols for a reason." She said, "I'm aware of the protocols. I'm asking which specific vulnerability you're identifying. I'd like to understand what you're actually concerned about, rather than the category of the concern." A silence. The man said, "Influence." She said, You're concerned that I'll influence the king. He said, it has historical precedent. She said, everything has historical precedent. That doesn't make it currently relevant. Another silence, this one with a different texture. She heard, very faintly, one of the other council members shift their weight, in the way that people do when they are surprised by something they weren't expecting. The woman in the group spoke for the first time. She said, what is your intention in staying here? Lena said, right now my intention is to finish reorganizing the record room, which is going to take approximately 3 more days. After that I'll decide. The woman said, and what is it you want? Lena said, today, to finish sorting this shelf. Tomorrow, to start on the eastern wall. Longer term, I haven't decided. She said, you don't have an agenda. Lena said, I have a very practical agenda. I want to be somewhere I'm not a problem to anyone, that has food, and where I can be useful. I walked into this territory because I was out of options, not because I had a plan. I'm doing what makes sense from day to day. The woman said nothing for a moment. Then she said, that's either very honest or very well constructed. Lena said, I've found that honesty is usually more efficient than strategy. Strategy requires remembering which version of events you told to which person, and I have too many other things to keep track of. She heard, from the back of the room, the sound that she was now starting to recognize as what happened when Cale Drace almost did something that could be interpreted as amusement, and did not quite complete it. The council member who had spoken first said, we'll be watching the situation. She said, all right. He said, with respect, you should understand that your position here is not permanent and not guaranteed. She said, I've never had a permanent or guaranteed position anywhere. I'm comfortable with that. She heard the council members leave. She heard Cale walk to his desk. She heard Simon, beside her, trying very hard not to do anything that could be characterized as reacting. She turned back to the shelf. She said, to Simon, let's keep going. Find the ones with the northern trademarks on them. Simon found the documents and handed them to her one at a time, and she handled each one, feeling the weight and texture, and the way the edges had aged, and she organized them by a system that had logic in it, rather than the accident of the order in which they had arrived. Behind her, Cale worked at his desk, and did not leave. That evening, in the kitchen, Owen told her that there were 2 types of flour he used, and that the bread she had liked best was made with the one that was harder to get in winter, and that he had a small reserve set aside for exactly this reason, because running out of the right flour was a minor tragedy that he was not prepared to tolerate. She thought about Lady Morrow's voice, and the council's careful concern, and the rejection mark on her wrist, and the 4 days she had spent alone in the borderlands. Then she thought about morning sun, and warm bread, and a man who had told her about 3 steps without being asked. She ate Owen's bread, and she thought that things could be a great deal worse than this, and she thought that she was perhaps starting, very carefully, and with considerable internal reservation, to mean it. She went to sleep that night, and woke the next morning, and the sun came through the east window, as it always did now, and she turned her face toward it, and stayed in it for a moment before she got up. She had been here a week. She thought she would stay a little longer. By the end of the 2nd week, Lena had reorganized 3 walls of the record room, identified a discrepancy in the northern trade agreements that had been costing the Ironvale Kingdom money for 7 years without anyone noticing, and been the subject of 3 separate conversations between members of the household that she was not supposed to know about, but did, because sound in a stone keep carries considerably further than people remember when they are trying to be discreet. The first conversation was between Simon and one of the other scribes, a woman named Priya, who had initially found Lena's presence in the record room an inconvenience, and had gradually shifted towards something she was not yet calling admiration, but that Lena thought would get there eventually. Simon told Priya that Lena could identify a document's approximate origin by touch alone, based on the quality and texture of the paper, and that this had turned out to be more useful than either of them had expected. Priya said that this was either very impressive or very strange, and she hadn't decided which. Simon said it was probably both. The second conversation was between 2 of Cale's guards, men she had not yet learned the names of, who had taken to occupying the hallway near the record room during the mornings, in a way that had begun to feel less like routine patrol and more like proximity for its own sake. They spoke in the low voices of people discussing something they found personally interesting, but would not publicly admit to finding interesting, and what they were discussing, as best she could interpret from the fragments that reached her, was whether she was a spy, and what kind. She found this more amusing than alarming. The third conversation was the one she did not find amusing. It happened in the corridor outside the East Wing, in the late afternoon of the 12th day, and the voices were Lady Morrow and a man whose voice Lena did not recognize but whose manner she placed immediately as the voice of someone who spent time with Lady Morrow by choice, which told her something specific about his values. They were speaking at the level of people who believed the corridor was empty, which it was when she had entered it from the other end, but was not anymore. Lady Morrow said that the girl, and she said it in the way people say that word when they mean something diminishing by it, had been in the keep for 12 days now, was spending several hours a day in the same room as Cale, and had apparently already identified herself as useful in a way that made removing her socially complicated. The man said that complications could be managed. Lady Morrow said she was aware of that, and that she wanted it managed carefully, because she had no intention of giving anyone grounds to accuse her of being unkind to a woman in difficult circumstances. She said the key was finding the right approach. The man said that an Omega woman without a pack and without resources was not in a position to resist many kinds of approach. Lady Morrow said that was true, but that she wanted something the king could not trace back to her, and that this required patience. Lena stood at the end of the corridor, and she listened to the tail end of this conversation, and she thought, very calmly, about what she was hearing. She was not surprised. She had known, since the first morning in the Great Hall, that Lady Morrow was not going to simply accept her presence. She had recognized the specific kind of opposition Lady Morrow represented, which was not the opposition of someone who was frightened or confused, but the opposition of someone who had a clear objective and was working toward it methodically. What she thought about, now, was what she was going to do with this information. She walked away from the corridor before Lady Morrow and her companion finished their conversation. She went to the kitchen, because the kitchen was where she went when she needed to think without it being obvious she was thinking. And Owen was there, and he did not require her to perform equanimity, which she appreciated because she was spending a certain amount of energy on maintaining it. Owen was making something with the herbs from the garden. She could smell it before she reached the kitchen. She came in and sat at the work table, which she had learned to navigate around carefully, because Owen moved items on it without predictable logic, and she sat and she listened to the sounds of him working. He said, after a while, without interrupting what he was doing, "Something's bothering you." She said, "What makes you say that?" He said, "You're sitting like someone who's deciding how far they can lean on a piece of furniture they don't fully trust yet." She considered this. She said, "Lady Morrow is planning something." Owen said, "Yes." She said, "You knew." He said, "I suspected." "What did you hear?" She told him briefly what she had caught in the corridor. Owen was quiet through most of it, and quiet for a moment after she finished. Then he said, "Helena Morrow is not a stupid woman. She is also not, at her core, a cruel one. But she has decided that what happened to Ilara, and what happened after, is the story that matters most to her, and she is very committed to protecting that story." Lena said, "What did happen?" Owen was quiet for a moment. He said, "The Queen died 3 years ago. She was 31. There are things about it that were never fully explained, at least not in public, and Helena has spent those 3 years trying to understand something that may not be understandable, and I think the effort of that has made her harder than she used to be." Lena said, "And Cale?" Owen said, "Cale has been a different version of himself since then. He was already not an easy man. He became a more isolated one." She sat with this. She said, "Is that why no one argues with him?" Owen said, "No one argued with him before either, but there is a difference between not arguing with someone because you respect them, and not arguing with someone because you're not sure what will happen if you do." She said, "Which one is it now?" Owen said, "Depends on the person. Depends on the day." He paused, and she heard the sound of something being stirred. "He's better than he was. I've watched him these past 2 weeks, and there's something different." He paused again. "I won't say what I think it is, but I've been cooking in this building for 31 years, and I can read what's in a room." She said, "Don't read things into rooms that aren't there." He said, "I never do." She left the kitchen, and went back to the record room for the remainder of the afternoon. And she worked through a set of correspondence files that had been piled without order in the back corner of the room, and she thought about what Owen had said, and what Lady Morrow had said, and what the trajectory of all of it might be. And by the end of the afternoon, she had arrived at the conclusion that she could not do anything useful about Lady Morrow's plans, except continue to behave consistently and trust that consistency was, in the long run, harder to undo than any specific maneuver. She was in the record room when Cale came back from what sounded like a long day. She could tell by the quality of his footsteps, which were slightly heavier than usual, the heaviness of sustained effort. He came in, and she heard him sit down, and she heard him pick up the papers on his desk, and she heard, a few minutes later, the quiet sound of him setting them down again. He said, "You're still here." She said, "I'm nearly through the correspondence pile." He said, "It's past dinner." She said, "Owen left something for me. I'll eat when I'm done." He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "You found the discrepancy in the Northern trade agreements." She said, "Simon found it. I told him where to look." He said, "Same thing." She said, "It really isn't. He found it." He said, "Why were you looking in the Northern trade agreements?" She said, "Because when I was going through the papers on the third shelf, there was a series of correspondence from the Northern traders that seemed to arrive and then stop abruptly, without any accompanying change in the trade logs. Something stopped being recorded that had been recorded before, and that kind of gap usually means either a change in practice or an error. It turned out to be an error that compounded over 7 years. He said, "No one noticed." She said, "No one was looking at the documents as a set. They were organized by date, so the pattern was invisible." He said, "We'll recover the loss." She said, "I know. Priya is drafting the correspondence." A pause. He said, "You seem to know a great deal about what's happening in this room." She said, "I work in this room." He said, "You also seem to know a great deal about what's happening in the rest of the keep." She said, "I've been mapping it." He said, "Mapping it." She said, "Mentally. The sounds, the patterns, which doors open at what times, who walks through which corridors and when, what the kitchen produces on which days, who is in which room, and approximately when. It's how I understand a space." He was quiet. She thought he was probably processing this in the way people sometimes process things about her, not with alarm exactly, but with the recalibration of someone who had been thinking about her one way and was now thinking about her a slightly different way. He said, "What have you learned?" She said, "About the keep." He said, "Yes." She thought about it honestly. She said, "I've learned that this is a well-run place that is slightly afraid of itself. The staff are competent, and the systems work, but people move carefully around certain subjects and certain rooms and certain times of day, and the caution is not the caution of a place where something might go wrong. It's the caution of a place where something already did." He was very still for a moment. She could tell by the absence of the small sounds that always accompanied his presence, the breath, the slight movements of a person in a chair. He said, "Yes." She said, "I'm not asking about it." He said, "I know." She said, "I'm just telling you what I hear." He said, "I know that too." She heard him stand up. She heard him move toward the window, the one on the east side of the room, the one she knew faced the direction of the courtyard where the fountain was. She heard him stop there, and she thought he was looking out of it, though she did not know what was out there to see. He said, "Elara would have liked you." She sat very still. He said, "She was the kind of person who liked people who were honest about what they knew and didn't know. She had no patience for performance." He paused. "You would have been friends, I think. She would have come to find you in the kitchen and made Owen tell her what you talked about." Lena said, "She sounds like someone worth knowing." He said, "She was." He said it in the settled, definitive way. Not with grief exactly, because the grief had been there long enough that it had become part of the architecture, just as a statement of fact that carried its full weight. She said, "I heard something today that I should tell you about." He turned from the window. She could tell by the small change in the direction his voice came from. She told him what she had heard in the corridor. She told him without embellishment or interpretation, exactly what Lady Morrow had said, and what the man with her had said, and what she had concluded from it. She kept her voice level, and she did not editorialize. When she finished, Kale was quiet for a long moment. He said, "How long have you known something like this was coming?" She said, "Since the first morning in the Great Hall." He said, "You didn't say anything." She said, "I didn't have anything specific to say, and I didn't want to make assumptions about what you would do about it." He said, "What do you think I'll do about it?" She said, "I don't know. That's why I didn't assume." He said, "I won't let it happen." She said, "You may not be able to stop everything she's planning without knowing all of it." He said, "I know." She said, "I can listen." He said, "I know that too." She said, "I'm not offering to spy on your household. I'm offering to pay attention, which I was already doing." He said, "I know the difference." She said, "Do you want me to?" He said, "Yes." She nodded. She went back to the correspondence pile. She heard him sit down at his desk again, and the sound of papers being moved, and the quiet that settled between them, which was a working quiet, a productive quiet, the quiet of two people in a room who were thinking about the same problem from different directions. Later she took the food that Owen had left, and she sat at the corner of the long table in the great hall, and she ate it, and she thought about the fact that Cale Drace had said his dead mate's name in front of her, directly, without preparation, and that she had the impression this was not something he did often or easily. She thought about Lady Morrow, who had loved someone she lost, and what that loss had calcified into. She thought about Cale, who had also lost someone, and what that loss had built around itself. She thought about her own losses, which were quieter, and more gradual, and less dramatic in their shape, but not, she thought, less significant. The sight she had lost slowly, over 2 years, until the world was entirely dark, and the darkness had become simply where she lived. The pack she had never quite belonged to. The mate who had never been a mate in any meaningful sense. The version of herself she had never quite been allowed to become, while she was in a place that saw her as a condition to be managed. She ate Owen's food, which was as excellent in the evening as it was in the morning, and she decided that she was not leaving Ironvale Keep anytime soon. Not because it was safe, because she was under no illusion that it was fully safe, and Lady Morrow's conversation in the corridor had confirmed as much. Not because she had nowhere else to go, though that was also true and she was honest with herself about it. She was staying because for the first time in a very long time, she was somewhere that was asking her what she was actually able to do, rather than telling her what she could not. That was not nothing. In her experience, it was very nearly everything. She went to bed in the room that had the east-facing window, and she slept well, deeply, the sleep of someone who had made a decision and put it to rest. And in the morning, the sun came through the window, and she turned her face toward it as she always did. She got up. She went to work. She was learning this keep and this place, and the specific nature of the silence that settled around a man who had been carrying something very heavy for 3 years, and she was not yet sure what she was going to do with any of what she was learning. But she was learning it. And that, for now, was enough. Nobody in the Ironvale Keep flinched around her. This was the thing Lena had been processing for 3 weeks, without finding the right words for it, and she found them on a Tuesday morning in the 4th week, while she was sitting at the corner of the long table eating breakfast and listening to the Keep wake up around her. Nobody in the Ironvale Keep flinched when she walked into a room. Nobody adjusted their posture into the particular configuration that meant they were preparing to be patient about something. Nobody's voice changed into the careful, slightly elevated register that people used when they were making an effort. They were simply people, doing the things people did in the morning, and she was simply a person, sitting at a corner of a table, with her hands around a cup of tea, and the two things existed beside each other, without either one requiring accommodation from the other. She had been thinking about why, and she thought she had arrived at an answer. It was because of Cale. Not directly, not in the sense that he had issued instructions, or made her position in the household a point of protocol. It was more that the people who worked in the Ironvale Keep were, in the main, people who took their cues from him, and his cue, from the beginning, had been to treat her as a person who was in his keep because he had chosen to have her there. He did not make anything of her condition. He did not make anything of her status as a rejected Omega. He had, essentially, treated her as a competent adult who had made herself useful, and the people around him had followed his lead the way water follows the path that's already been cut. She had never had that before. She had not known, until she had it, how much she had not had it. The fourth week brought other things too. Simon had begun to arrive in the record room before her in the mornings, which she knew because she could hear the sounds of him already settled and working when she arrived, the particular rhythm of his movements when he had been at it long enough to stop being self-conscious. He had reorganized one of the smaller shelves according to the system she had introduced, and had, without being asked, gone back through it to correct a categorization error he had caught on his own. She had found the correction by feel, running her fingers over the documents he had rearranged, and she had felt the distinct satisfaction of a system being understood, rather than merely followed. Priya had stopped giving her the widest possible berth in the hallways, and had started stopping to ask her questions. The questions were, initially, practical ones, related to the record system. They had, by the third week, evolved into the more personal questions that people ask when they are actually curious, rather than professionally curious. Priya had asked where she was from, and what the Silverstone pack was like, and what she had done there. Lena had answered honestly and without elaboration, and Priya had listened with the attention of someone who was filing information, because she found it genuinely interesting, rather than because she had a use for it. The guards in the hallway outside the record room had been given names by now. The one on the left was called Ned, and the one on the right was called Marcus, and she had learned their names because they had eventually stopped pretending they were not curious about her and had started asking her things directly, which she had found considerably easier to manage than the indirect curiosity. Ned had asked her how she knew where she was going in the keep. She had explained her mapping method to him, and he had listened with the focused attention of someone who worked in security and found navigational systems professionally interesting. Marcus had asked whether she could hear when people were lying. She had told him that she could sometimes hear the difference in people's breathing, and that she found behavioral patterns in general more telling than any specific indicator. Marcus had thought about this for a moment, and then had said that it sounded useful. She had said that it was. Darcy was now, without question, a friend. Not in the careful, managed way that Lena had come to associate with the relationships available to her in the Silverstone pack. The friendships that were always one bad assessment away from being withdrawn. Darcy was straightforwardly friendly, in the way that young people sometimes are, when they have not yet learned to be guarded about it. And her friendship had a quality of ease to it, that Lena, who had spent years being careful about how much she leaned on any connection, found she was leaning into more than she had planned. Darcy brought her things, not because she had been asked to, but because she thought of them. A piece of fruit from the morning delivery that was exactly ripe and would not be later. A blanket for the window seat in the record room, because the mornings were getting cooler, and Darcy had noticed that Lena tended to sit near the window when she needed to think. A small carved object that she pressed into Lena's hands one afternoon and said was something she'd bought at the market and thought Lena might like to have to hold. Lena had turned it over in her hands and found it was a bird, roughly carved, with the texture of old cedar, and she had put it in her bag and carried it with her, and it was the newest thing in the collection of objects that constituted her worldly possessions. And then there was Cale. Cale, who came to the record room every morning and stayed later than he needed to, who had begun to speak more, not a great deal more, but measurably more. The incremental increase of a man who was recalibrating some internal calculation, who had told her about the 3 steps and continued to tell her about practical things. The loose stone on the 4th stair of the west wing, the door in the north corridor that needed lifting slightly to close properly, the echo pattern in the great hall that meant voices from the kitchen passage carried unexpectedly far. He told her these things as they came up, casually, without ceremony, the way people tell each other useful information when they are sharing a space. She noticed. She noticed, and she was careful about what she did with the noticing. On the morning of the 23rd day, something happened that she had not been expecting. She was in the record room alone. Cale had not yet arrived. Simon was in the Eastern Archive pulling correspondence files, and she was working through the last section of a trade document that she had been untangling for 2 days. The door opened, and someone came in who was not Cale, and was not any of the people she had become familiar with. She knew this before the person spoke, because the footsteps were unfamiliar, heavier on the left foot than the right, the gait of someone with an old injury that had healed imperfectly. She put down the document. The person said, "You're the woman from Silverstone." The voice was male, middle-aged, and carried the accent of the Northern Territories, the slightly rounded vowels of someone from far north. She said, "Yes." He said, "My name is Garrett. I'm the head warrior." She said, "I've heard your name." He said, I'm sure you have. He moved further into the room, and she tracked him by the change in his footsteps as he went from the stone floor near the door to the wooden floor near the shelves. He stopped at a distance she estimated at 10 feet. I want to ask you something directly. She said, Go ahead. He said, Are you here because of the pack wars? She said, I don't know what that means. In relation to me. He said, There's a theory that the Silverstone pack sent you as a scout, that the rejection was staged, that the reason you've ended up in the king's record room with access to trade agreements is not an accident. She said, That's a detailed theory. He said, I'm a careful man. She said, I can tell. Can I ask what evidence you have for it? He said, The timing. The Silverstone pack has been in negotiations with the Orith Alliance for 6 months. Ironvale territory is directly relevant to 3 of those negotiations. An Omega woman rejected in a public ceremony and left at the border of Ironvale territory is one of the more effective ways to get an operative inside a keep without appearing to put one there. She said, Yes, it would be. If the Silverstone pack were capable of that level of strategic thinking. A pause. She said, I'm not saying your concern isn't valid. It is. And it's the right concern to have. I'm saying that the Silverstone pack's Alpha Council is not, in my experience, subtle. The rejection ceremony used exactly 3 reasons: incompatibility, insufficient pack contribution, and physical limitation, in that order, which is the standard legal language from the pack protocols. If it had been staged, they would have used more specific language to make it more convincing. They used the default language because it was the quickest path to what they actually wanted, which was to not have to house me anymore. Garrett was quiet. She said, I understand you're doing your job. I'm not offended. You should be asking these questions. He said, Most people get offended when they're accused of spying. She said, Most people who are accused of spying are being accused by someone who has the power to act on the accusation. Being offended would be a waste of energy. He said, You're practical. She said, Yes. He said, The king trusts you. She said, He finds me useful. I'm not sure those are the same thing. He said, In his case they might be. She said nothing. He said, I'm going to keep watching. She said, That's your right. He said, You're not worried about it. She said, I'm not doing anything that requires worrying about being watched. If you watch carefully enough, you'll find that. He left the record room the way he came in, the heavier footfall on the left, and she heard him down the corridor and then gone. She turned back to the document. She was working through it with her fingers, tracing the edges, reading the information she had access to, which was the physical evidence of the paper itself, its weight, its age, the impression left by the seal on the back, things that Simon or Priya would read from its text, and she read from everything else. She thought about Garrett's question, and she thought about the answer she had given, and she thought, with some surprise, that she had not been unsettled by it. She had been watching herself, lately, for signs of the particular anxiety that had lived in her chest for most of her time in the Silverstone pack, the low-level alertness of someone who always knows they are one bad decision by someone else, away from a very different situation. The alertness had not disappeared, exactly, but it had changed quality. It was less urgent. She was not certain what to make of that. Cale came in at mid-morning. She heard him before the door opened, the familiar weight of his footsteps in the hallway, the specific pattern she had catalogued now with the precision of months of proximity. She had been in the keep for 23 days, and she could identify his footstep from anyone else's in the building. He came in, and she heard him stop when he noticed the quality of the room. He said, What happened? She said, Garrett came by. He said, When? She said, An hour ago. He said, What did he say? She told him. She told him the same way she had told him about Lady Morrow's conversation in the corridor, directly and without adding her own feelings about it. When she finished, she heard Cale move toward his desk, not quickly, but with the particular controlled movement of someone deciding not to be visibly reactive. He said, I'll speak with him. She said, Don't. He's doing his job correctly. He said, He accused you of espionage. She said, He raised a legitimate concern and questioned me directly about it. Those are different things. He was perfectly civil. A pause. He said, You're not angry. She said, Should I be? He said, Most people would be. She said, I've been accused of worse things with less logic behind them. At least Garrett's theory makes sense. He said, it doesn't account for the fact that you were genuinely alone in the borderlands for 3 days with an injured ankle. She said, he can't rule that out. He only has my account of it. He said, I saw you walk in. She said, I know. He said, your ankle was wrapped by morning. She said, Vera did that. He said, Vera told me before she did it. She paused. She said, I see. He said, I know what someone looks like when they've been walking alone for 3 days without enough food. That is not the kind of thing that is easily staged. She said, you believed me from the beginning. It came out less like a question than it sounded in her head. He said, yes. She said, why? He said, because you walked into me and told me I was standing in the middle of a path. She said, that's not a reason. He said, it's part of one. People with agendas are careful. You were not careful. You were honest, and you were exhausted, and you were irritated that there was something in your way, and those are not the qualities of someone who has spent 6 months being positioned to walk into a king's territory. She sat with this. She said, Garrett has a point though. He said, Garrett has a job. His job is to be suspicious. I support that. It doesn't change my assessment. She said, what is your assessment exactly? He was quiet for a moment, long enough that she thought he might not answer. He said, that you are exactly who you say you are. A woman who was badly treated by people who should have known better, who survived 3 days in the border territory, on determination and a working knowledge of edible plants, who has more practical intelligence than anyone who has worked in this record room in the past decade, and who has been honest with me about every significant thing that has happened since she arrived. She was quiet too. The morning light was coming through the record room windows, and she could feel the slight warmth of it on the right side of her face, the same position it always hit her at this time of day in this room, and she thought about what he had said. She said, you've been thinking about this. He said, I think about most things. She said, about me specifically. A pause. He said, yes. She said, that might be complicated. He said, many things are. She said, I'm a rejected Omega, with a rejection mark, and no pack, and no resources, and I'm in your record room, reorganizing 7 years of misfiled documents. I am not a simple situation. He said, no, you're not. She said, I'm not sure what to do with complicated. He said, neither am I. Not anymore. She turned back to the documents. She heard him settle at his desk. The room resumed its working quiet, the paper sounds and the pen sounds and the distant sound of the fountain in the courtyard below, and she thought about what it meant that they were both in the same room, thinking about the same complicated thing, and choosing not to do anything about it right now except keep working. Later, in the kitchen, she told Owen she had heard Cale's footstep and known it was him before the door opened. Owen said, from the hallway. She said, yes. He said, how many people in the keep can you do that with? She said, most of them now. He said, how many of those can you identify by just one footstep? She thought about it. She said, Vera, Darcy, Simon, Garrett, because of his left foot, you, a few of the guards. He said, and Cale. She said, yes. He put something down on the work surface. He said, you know, I've been cooking in this building for 31 years. She said, I know. He said, I've only ever been able to identify one other person's footstep from a hallway's distance, with that kind of certainty. She said, who? He said, Alara. She said, Owen. He said, I'm just telling you what I've observed. She said, don't read things into rooms that aren't there. He said, I never do. She was quiet for the rest of her time in the kitchen, and she went back to the record room in the afternoon, and she worked through the rest of the afternoon, and she did not let herself think too carefully about what Owen had said, because thinking too carefully about it felt like the beginning of something she was not ready to have a beginning for. But she noticed, that evening, walking back to her room through the keep, that her feet were very confident on the stairs, and on the turn at the second floor, and on the corridor to her door, and she had not even needed to count the steps. She knew exactly where she was. The fire started in the east wing on the 31st night. She was asleep when it began, and she woke not to the smell of smoke, which reached her a few moments later, but to the sound. The sound of fire in an old stone building is specific and unmistakable once you have heard it. It is not the sound of flames exactly, though that is part of it. It is the sound of a building changing, the small rapid pops and shifts of materials responding to heat, the deepening undertone that comes when something substantial is burning, rather than something small. She was standing before she had fully finished processing what had woken her. The smoke smell reached her at the same moment her feet found the floor. It was coming from the east, which told her the east wing, which told her the south end of the keep's second floor, which was exactly what she did not need to hear, because she was in the north end of the second floor, and the staircase that led down to the ground level was on the east side. She did not panic. She had learned, over many years of navigating environments that other people found challenging, with the benefit of sight, and she navigated without it, that panic was one of the least useful states available to a human being. What panic did was remove the ability to process information quickly, which was the exact ability she most needed right now. She found her shoes. She had left them at the foot of the bed in the position she always left them, right-angled to the bed frame at a specific distance, and she found them in approximately 3 seconds. She put them on. She found her bag, which was always under the bed at the left side, and she pulled it out and put it over her shoulder. She did not pack anything more than what the bag already contained. She went to the door and felt it before she opened it. This was a thing she had learned, not from anyone in the Silverstone pack, not from a formal training, but from the accumulated logic of living in a world where she had to make sensible decisions about unsafe things without being able to see them. You feel the door before you open it. If the door is hot, you do not open it. The door was not hot. She opened it. The corridor smelled of smoke but was not obscured by it yet. The smoke was not dense, not at this end of the hallway. She could breathe without difficulty. She moved immediately to the right, which was the direction away from the east wing, and toward the north staircase, which was a secondary staircase she had mapped on her second day in the keep, precisely because she liked knowing where all the exits were. She counted steps and she moved quickly. She could hear other people moving now. The keep was alive with the particular quality of human sound that comes in a crisis, not shouting, not screaming, but the urgent, compressed sounds of people who have woken up fast and are making decisions quickly. Doors opening, footsteps at pace, the distant sound of someone calling instructions in a carrying voice she identified as Garrett's. She reached the north staircase and started down. She was on the second step when she ran into someone coming up. The collision was less dramatic than the first one she had experienced in this keep, partly because she was not using her full walking speed, and partly because she had her staff in her hand, and its tip caught the person's leg before she walked into them completely. She stopped. The person stopped. The voice said, "Lena." It was Cale. She said, "The north stair is clear." He said, "I know. I'm going up." She said, "The smoke is coming from the east wing." He said, "Yes. Darcy is in her room in the east wing." Lena stopped. She said, "How bad is it?" He said, "The room at the end of the east corridor is fully involved. The corridor itself has smoke, but the fire hasn't reached it." She said, "Darcy's room is 3 doors from the end." He said, "Yes." She said, "Go." He went past her and up the stairs, and she heard his footsteps going toward the east at full speed. No longer the measured pace of the man who moved through his keep in the practiced way of someone who owned every inch of it. Just running. She reached the ground level and went through the north exit into the main courtyard. She could hear people already there. The coordinated sound of bucket lines being organized. Garrett's voice giving directions from somewhere near the east side of the building. She moved to the edge of the courtyard and stood where she would not be in anyone's way. The smoke was heavier out here than she had expected. She could hear the fire now, properly, the low roar of it from the east wing, and beneath that the sound of timbers under stress, the specific complaint of materials doing something they were not designed to do. She stood and she counted the people in the courtyard around her. She was counting them and tracking their positions by sound, keeping a running inventory of who was present and where, when she reached 14 and stopped because 14 was not enough. There were more people than that in the keep, she said, to no one specifically. Who is still inside? Nobody answered her directly, because in the middle of a fire in the middle of the night, people were focused on what was directly in front of them. She turned back to the north door and went inside. She was not going toward the fire. She was going toward the kitchen corridor, which was on the ground floor of the north side of the building, and was the most likely place to find someone who had not made it to the courtyard. Owen was 63 years old and slept in the small room off the kitchen, and his hearing had been reduced by decades of working in a loud environment, and she thought about all of this at considerable speed as she moved through the ground floor corridor toward the kitchen. The smoke was thin here, barely noticeable. She reached the kitchen and found the door to Owen's room by memory and knocked on it with the heel of her hand. Once, twice, 3 times. She heard Owen inside, the sound of someone who was deeply asleep, being very suddenly not asleep. The confused, effortful transition. She said, loudly, "Owen, there's a fire. You need to come with me now." She heard him get up. She heard him moving around. She said, "Take your shoes and go. Don't pack anything." He came to the door, and she heard the door open, and she felt him in the doorway, the warmth and the proximity. She said, "Follow my voice." And she turned and walked, and she heard him following, and she moved them both down the corridor and out the north exit into the courtyard. She delivered him to the edge of the courtyard, and then she went back inside. She was not being heroic, she was being systematic, a systematic inventory of where she knew people to be in the building at night. She went to the east corridor on the ground floor and worked her way down it, knocking on every door. 3 rooms, 3 people sleeping through the noise, 3 people guided out to the courtyard. The smoke in this part of the building was getting thicker, but was still navigable. She wet the bottom of her shirt with the water she still carried in the skin at her belt, held it over her mouth, and kept moving. She was coming back through the east corridor's intersection with the main hall, when someone ran into her. It was different from the other collisions she had experienced in this building. This one was fast and slightly desperate, the collision of someone not watching where they were going, because they were focused entirely on where they needed to be. She went back 2 steps, and caught herself, and the person with her made a sound she recognized. She said, "Darcy." Darcy said, "Lena," and then, immediately after, "Cale got me out. He's in there." She was coughing between the words, the cough of someone who had breathed too much smoke. "I couldn't find you." Lena said, "I'm here. Go out. North exit. Go." Where Darcy went. Lena turned back toward the east corridor and immediately stopped, because the quality of the air was different now, thicker and hotter on the left side, which was the direction of the east wing, and she could hear the fire more clearly from here, closer than it had been 5 minutes ago. She said, loudly, "Cale." No answer. She said it again, louder. She heard, from somewhere in the smoke behind the main hall junction, a sound. Not words, just a sound. She moved toward it. The smoke here was dense enough that she was counting on her ears more than usual, and even her ears were less reliable in a space that was acoustically disrupted by the fire's own noise. She moved carefully, staff in front of her, finding the walls, keeping her orientation by the familiar geometry of a building she had mapped precisely. She found him by the sound. He was moving, but slowly, and his breathing was wrong, the thick, effortful breathing of someone who had taken in too much smoke. She reached him by following the sound of his breathing, and she put her hand on his arm. He said, in a voice that was considerably less composed than his normal voice, "The room at the end is gone." She said, "I know, come with me." He said, "There might be someone else in there." She said, "There isn't. I counted everyone out." She was pulling him as she said it, not waiting for agreement. "Come on." He came. She navigated them back through the main hall junction and down the north corridor and out the north exit and into the courtyard, and the smoke-thick air of the courtyard felt, by comparison, very nearly clean. She heard people around them immediately. She heard Garrett's voice, much closer now, and she heard someone else, a woman, making the sharp sounds of someone managing distress, and she heard what she thought was more than 30 people in the courtyard around her, and she allowed herself to stop counting. She let go of his arm. She heard him breathe, several long breaths, the effortful kind, the kind that sound like work. She heard him cough twice, which was not nothing. And then he put his hand over hers. Not her arm, her hand. His fingers closed over her hand where it hung at her side. She stopped. He held her hand for approximately 4 seconds. She counted them. because counting was what she did when the thing she was processing was too large to process without something to anchor it. 4 seconds. Then his hand moved and she heard him straighten and step forward and begin speaking to Garrett. She stood where she was. The fire was still audible from the east wing. The bucket line was still moving, the rhythmic sounds of organized effort, water and urgency, and people working together toward a common problem. She could hear Darcy's voice somewhere to her left, still slightly rough from the smoke but talking, which was good. She could hear Owen, much further away, his low voice and someone responding to it. She was aware of her own hand, where his had been, with a precision that she would have been embarrassed to describe aloud. She thought, I was thrown back 5 years. Not to the bonding ceremony, not to the rejection, further than that. To the year she was 17, when her sight was still fading but was not yet gone, and she had been touched with something that had care in it, something that was not the managed care of people who were accommodating her, and she had known, even then, that it was something specific, and not a general thing. She had not been touched like that since. She had not been touched like that by him. It was 4 seconds, a hand over hers in the aftermath of a fire. She understood the perfectly reasonable explanations for it. She also understood that she was standing in the middle of a courtyard at whatever hour the middle of the night was, and that she was tracking the location of Cale Drace by the sound of his voice, which she could distinguish from Garrett's voice and Owen's voice, and the 17 other voices in the courtyard around her, and that this was not a neutral fact. She put the hand into her pocket, then she took it out again, because the gesture was obvious to her, and she did not want to be doing obvious things. Garrett was organizing people into shelter groups. Lena listened to his instructions and identified the group nearest her, and moved to it. Vera materialized at her elbow without announcement, which was very Vera, and told her that the east wing had been contained. The fire would not reach the main keep, and that a room had been prepared on the ground floor for the people who normally slept in the east wing. Lena said, "Is everyone accounted for?" Vera said, "Yes," and then, after a short pause, Darcy said, "You came back in for Owen." Lena said, "Someone had to." Vera said, "And for Cale." Lena said, "He was inside." Vera said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "Come inside. You smell like smoke." Lena went inside. She was taken to a different room than her usual one, a room on the ground floor that smelled like storage and old timber, and had no window that she could immediately locate in the dark. She identified the room's dimensions quickly, found the bed, sat on the edge of it. She sat there for a long time. She thought about 4 seconds. She thought about the way his voice had sounded when he said the room at the end is gone, not like a strategic report. Not like a man assessing damage, but like a man who had just been confronted with the fact that something was gone and would not come back. She thought about the fact that she had navigated a burning building in the middle of the night by the sound of his breathing. She thought about Owen saying Alara's name. She thought, "I need to be careful." She thought, "I am not sure I know how to be careful about this specific thing." She lay down on the unfamiliar bed, and she listened to the building settle around her. The sounds of people finding rooms and doors closing, and the muted, distant work of people continuing to manage the fire's aftermath, and she thought about all of it. Dawn came. She knew it from the birds, different birds than the ones she knew from her usual room, pitched slightly differently, which made sense because this room was in a different part of the building. She lay still and listened to them. She did not feel the sun. This room had no east window. After a while she got up and went to the kitchen. Owen was already there, which surprised her less than it might have a month ago, because Owen was not a man who let disruption interfere with his relationship to his kitchen. He did not say anything about the night. He made tea and put it in front of her, and said that the herb garden was fine, which she understood as his way of communicating that certain things were intact and accounted for. She said, "You slept through the fire alarm." He said, "I knew someone would come." She said, "You didn't know that." He said, "I suspected." She drank her tea. The kitchen was quiet in the specific way of early morning, before the day had assembled its noise. She sat with the quiet, and she thought about what she was going to do. She was going to do the same thing she had been doing. She was going to work in the record room. She was going to eat Owen's food. She was going to talk to Darcy, and be careful about her ankle on the west staircase, and pay attention to what Lady Morrow was arranging, and listened to the things that the keep's sounds told her about the state of things. And she was going to be very, very careful about the specific quality of the feeling that came from those 4 seconds in the courtyard. Because she had lived in a pack for 23 years, and she knew what it felt like to have something taken away after you had started to count on it, and she was not interested in doing that again. Not that, again. The East Wing had to be assessed for structural damage. Garrett organized it. 3 rooms were unusable. The rest could be cleaned and reclaimed within a week. The affected people were relocated to ground floor rooms. Darcy was given a room near Lena's usual room, which made the morning hallway slightly louder than it had been, because Darcy was a person who greeted the morning with an energy Lena found slightly remarkable and mostly endearing. Cale said nothing to her about the courtyard, not on that morning or on the mornings after. He came to the record room, and he worked, and she worked, and the comfortable silence between them resumed. She did not know if this was because it had meant nothing to him, or because he was also being careful. She thought it might be the second thing. She thought this because she had learned, over weeks of sharing a working space with him, that the things he did not say were not absences, they were presences that had not yet found their words. She waited. She had become good at waiting. It was, she thought, one of the few advantages of learning patience the hard way. She went back to the record room. She went back to the documents. She sat in her usual place with the morning light falling to the right of her, and the smell of old paper and cedar around her, and she thought about nothing, except the thing in front of her, which was a trade agreement from 8 years ago, that needed to be cross-referenced with 3 other documents, and filed under the correct northern region. She was doing this. She was doing it well. She was also, in the quiet back part of her attention, listening for footsteps in the hallway. The formal challenge arrived on the 42nd day. Lena knew something was coming before it arrived. She had been listening to Lady Morrow for 6 weeks, and Lady Morrow was a woman who telegraphed her preparations in sound, the increase in closed-door conversations, the particular quality of the footsteps of people coming and going from Lady Morrow's suite, not the casual footsteps of social visits but the purposeful footsteps of people who had been summoned and who left having received instructions. The way certain conversations in the keep's common spaces stopped when Lena came within range, which was different from the way conversations had stopped in the early days from simple curiosity. Now the stopping had a shape to it. She told Cale. She told him on the 40th day, which was the morning after she had heard, from the corridor outside the council chambers, a voice that she identified as belonging to the man who had been with Lady Morrow in the East Corridor 6 weeks ago, speaking for an extended period to what sounded like multiple listeners. She said, "It's happening soon, in the next few days." He said, "What specifically?" She said, "I don't know the mechanism, but it's formal. She's been preparing documentation. I can hear the sound of papers being organized and a particular type of correspondence being sealed, which has a different sound from regular letters, thicker paper, a heavier seal." He said, "Helena knows the protocols." She said, "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I'll speak to her." She said, "Don't. If you speak to her before she makes the formal move, she'll find a different path and you won't see it coming." He said, "So, we wait." She said, "We let it arrive, and then we deal with it on the record." He said, "You don't have an advocate here, formally." She said, "I know." He said, "Under keep law, anyone facing a formal challenge has the right to one." She said, "I know that too." He said, "I can appoint someone from the council." She said, "Who would you appoint?" He said, "My head advisor, Noel. He is fair." She said, "Would he take it if you asked him to?" He said, "Yes." She said, "Then ask him. But tell him not to speak for me. Tell him he's there as a witness to procedure, not as my voice. I'll speak for myself." Cale said, "That's a harder path." She said, "I know, but it's the cleaner one. If I speak for myself, the record shows that. If someone else speaks for me, the record shows that too. And the record of an Omega who required an advocate to defend herself is a different story than the record of an Omega who defended herself." He was quiet for a longer moment than usual. He said, "You've thought about this." She said, "I've thought about nothing else for a week." He said, "All right." The formal challenge arrived on the 42nd morning. It was delivered by the keep's official record keeper, a formal procedure that Lena gathered from the quality of the man's voice. and the particular ceremonial character of the phrases he used. He came to the record room, which she thought was not an accident, and he read from a document in a voice that was trying very hard to be neutral. The challenge was called an inquiry of appropriate presence. It was, as formal challenges went, dressed in the language of concern for the keep's well-being. The language described the presence of an unmated Omega woman in the household of an unmated Alpha King as a potential source of disruption, and it cited, by reference to pack law and keep protocol, a series of historical precedents that suggested such situations were to be formally evaluated before being permitted to continue. The challenge was brought by Lady Helena Morrow with the formal support of 3 named council members. It requested a hearing before the full council, to be held at the end of the week. Lena sat through the reading without moving. When it was done, she said, "Thank you," to the record keeper, and he left. She sat with the document's existence for a moment. Then she went back to the shelf she had been working on. Simon, from across the room, said quietly, "Lena," she said, "keep working, Simon." He said, "Are you all right?" She said, "Yes. And the answer is better on the 3rd shelf from the east, because the documents on that shelf are the ones that the system was designed to manage. Keep going." He kept going. 3 days. She had 3 days to prepare for a hearing before the full council of the Ironvale Kingdom, in which Lady Helena Morrow was going to make the formal argument that Lena's presence in the keep was inappropriate and potentially destabilizing, with the documented support of 3 council members, and in which Lena was going to have to answer that argument in public and on the record. She thought about it in the evenings, sitting in her room, or in the kitchen with Owen, or in the keep's small inner courtyard, which she had discovered in the 2nd week, as a place she could be outside, without navigating anyone else's questions about why she was outside. She thought about what Lady Morrow was likely to say, and what arguments she would use, and what the legal and social precedents were that supported those arguments, and she thought about what the true answers to those arguments were. She did not think about how she felt about it, mostly because feelings were not going to be useful in that council room, and she would rather spend the 3 days on things that were. Cale did not make anything of the days between the challenge and the hearing. He came to the record room each morning and worked, and the silence between them was the working silence it had always been. She appreciated this more than she could have explained. She did not want to be prepared, managed, or coached. She wanted to do the work she had been doing, and she wanted the space to think, without anyone making the space feel like a special accommodation. The morning of the hearing, Darcy came to her room before breakfast. She did not say much. She sat on the edge of the chair by the window, and she was quiet in the way that people are quiet when they want very much to say something, but understand that the thing they want to say would not help. After a while she said, "You'll be good." Lena said, "I'll be honest." "Good would be nice on top of that." Darcy said, "You're always honest. That's the same thing here." Lena said, "It isn't actually. But thank you." Darcy said, "Vera told me that the king spoke to the council advisor about procedure last night. For a long time." Lena said, "I know." Darcy said, "He's been awake since very early this morning." Lena said, "How do you know?" Darcy said, "The courtyard guard told me when I came down." He walked the battlements for 2 hours before dawn. Lena sat with this for a moment. She said, "He shouldn't lose sleep over it." Darcy said, "I don't think he was able to help it." She did not respond to that. The hearing was held in the main council chamber, which was a room Lena had mapped on her 14th day. It was a large rectangular room, with a raised dais at the far end, where the council table sat, and a floor-level speaking area before it, where the parties to any formal proceeding were expected to stand. The acoustics of the room were good. She knew that from experience. The stone carried voices clearly, and the room was built to make sure every word spoken in the floor-level area reached the council table without effort. She entered the room with Cale's advisor, Noel, a quiet man with a precise voice, who had said to her on their only meeting before today that he intended to follow her direction entirely and would intervene only if he saw a procedural violation. She had said that was exactly right and thanked him. She heard the room's population as she came in. Council members at the dais. She counted 9, which was the full council. Lady Morrow somewhere to the right, with 2 other people nearby. Garrett near the far wall, Vera at the back, and Cale at the head of the dais. He was the king, and this was his council chamber. and his presence at the head of it was procedurally expected, but she was aware of it in a way that had nothing to do with procedure. The council chair, whose name was Elder Finley, called the proceeding to order. He read the formal challenge. Then he asked Lady Morrow to speak. Lady Morrow spoke. She was precise, and she was prepared, and she did not use cruel language. She used legal language, which was worse in some respects, because it was harder to argue against, and left less visible trace of its effect on a person. She cited the precedents she had prepared. She described, in the careful language of genuine concern, the ways in which the keep's proper functioning could be affected by the presence of an unmated Omega in an Alpha King's household. She said she respected the current guest's evident competence and found no fault in her character, but that the situation was one that history had shown to be problematic regardless of character. She said the word Omega 14 times in her presentation. Lena counted. When Lady Morrow finished, Elder Finley asked Lena to respond. She stood where she was standing, and she thought for one moment about what she wanted to say, not in the sense of what would work best, not in the sense of what would make the best impression, but in the most direct possible sense. What was true? She said. I want to start by acknowledging that Lady Morrow's concern is not fabricated. The history she has cited is real. Situations like this one have historically been complicated, and it is not unreasonable to evaluate whether that history is relevant here. She heard, from the direction of the council table, a small shift in the quality of the room's attention. She continued. She said, "What I would ask the council to consider is not whether the historical precedent is real, but whether I fit it. The precedent Lady Morrow describes involves Omegas entering households with intent, with an objective, and with resources. I arrived at the border of this territory with an injured ankle, half a skin of water, and no food, having walked alone through the borderlands for 3 days after being publicly rejected by my pack." She said, "The king did not bring me here because I am an Omega. He brought me here because he found me alone in his border territory, and the alternative was to leave me there. I have been in this keep for 42 days. In those 42 days I have reorganized the record room, identified a 7-year error in the northern trade accounts that has been corrected, assisted the scribes with a categorization system that is now functional, and been involved in getting several people out of the East Wing during the fire 2 weeks ago." She said, "I do not have an agenda for this keep. I do not have resources to be a strategic actor. I am a woman without a pack, without a bond, and without options, who was offered shelter, and who has tried to make that shelter worthwhile. If the council determines that the precedent outweighs all of that, I will accept it, but I would ask you to determine it on the basis of what I actually am, rather than on the basis of the category I fit." She stopped. The room was quiet in the specific way that a room full of people becomes quiet when something they were expecting to be one thing has turned out to be something else. Elder Finley said, "Lady Morrow, do you have a response to that?" Lady Morrow said, in a voice that was controlled and even, that she maintained her position and believed the precedent was clear. Finley said, "Council members, the floor is open for questions." 3 of the council members asked questions. They were reasonable questions, the kind that came from genuine uncertainty rather than predetermined position, and she answered them all directly. One asked about her plans. She said she did not have any, beyond continuing to be useful to the keep for as long as she was permitted, and as long as it made sense for her to stay. One asked about the rejection mark. She said it was on her left wrist, and it was there, factually, and it was what it was. One asked whether she had any communication with the Silverstone pack since leaving. She said she had not, and had no means or desire to. Then Finley said, "My lord." Cale spoke. He said, "I am going to say what I should have said at the beginning of this proceeding, which is that the guest in question is here because I invited her to stay, and that I do not see a reason to revise that invitation. The precedents Lady Morrow has cited are real. The guest's response to them is also real. I find the second more compelling." He said, "She found an error in my record system in 4 days that cost this kingdom money for 7 years. She identified, by listening alone, every person unaccounted for during the fire in the East Wing and assisted in getting them out. She has conducted herself with honesty and consistency throughout the 6 weeks she has been in this keep. I do not see the evidence for the concern." He paused. He said, "I also want to note, for the formal record, that the woman standing before you defended herself in this proceeding, without an advocate, in a room full of people who have more legal standing in this territory than she does, and did it with more precision and more honesty than I have seen in formal proceedings conducted by people with every advantage she lacks. That should be on the record. The room was very quiet. Finley said, "The council will deliberate." The deliberation took 9 minutes. She counted. 9 minutes was not long. She thought it meant something that it was not long. Finley came back and said the council found no grounds to require the guest's departure, and that the matter was closed. Lady Morrow left the council chamber without speaking to anyone. Lena stood in the floor-level speaking area for a moment after most people had started to move, getting her bearings in the sound of the dispersing room. She heard Noelle say something formal and brief near her left shoulder. She heard Vera at the back of the room. She heard Garrett moving toward the main door. And then she heard Cale step down from the dais. He crossed the chamber floor and she heard him stop, near enough that she could have reached him in 2 steps. He said, quietly, so only she could hear it, "Are you all right?" She said, "Yes." He said, "That was harder than it should have been." She said, "A lot of things are harder than they should have been. I'm used to it." He said, "You shouldn't have to be." She said, "I know." A moment. He said, "Come and eat something." She said, "I'm not hungry." He said, "Owen has been cooking since 4 in the morning. He heard about the hearing, and he has been stress cooking, which means there is a ridiculous amount of food in the kitchen right now, and he will be genuinely upset if none of it is eaten." She said, "That's manipulation again." He said, "Yes." She said, "You need to stop that." He said, "It works." She thought about it for a moment. Then she said, "All right. But I'm having what I want, not what's been designated as the thing I should have." He said, "Obviously." She walked beside him through the council chamber and out into the corridor, and she thought about what he had said on the record in that room, and she thought about the particular way he said things, not with flourish, not with performance, but with the weight of someone who had decided what was true and was saying it. She thought about the 42 days behind her, and the morning she had walked into his chest in a borderland forest and told him he was standing in the middle of a path. She thought about 4 seconds in a courtyard. She was being careful. She was still being careful. But careful was not the same as absent, and she was present, fully present, in the way she was present in this building now, in the way she moved through it, without needing to count her steps. She knew where she was. She was walking toward the kitchen with a man who had stood in his own council chamber and defended her on the record, and she was going to eat Owen's stress cooking, which was going to be excellent, and she was going to let herself do that without calculating the cost of it. Just this once. Just today. She thought she had probably been lying to herself about how careful she was being for at least 2 weeks. She thought this, as she turned into the kitchen corridor, and moved toward the warm smell of everything Owen had been making since before dawn, and she thought it was probably time to be honest about what she was not managing to be careful about. She went into the kitchen. Owen looked up and said, "I made enough for everyone." She said, "I can tell." He said, "Sit down." She sat. He put something in front of her, and the smell of it was so specifically warm and good after the cold formal morning of the council chamber that she sat still for a moment and just breathed it in. She heard Cale sit down across the table from her. Neither of them said anything. Owen moved around them with the practiced efficiency of a man who had been feeding people through difficult days for 31 years. And the kitchen was warm, and the food was real, and the morning was over, and she let herself be there in it, without running any part of the calculation that she had been running for the last 6 weeks. Just for now. Just for this. The evening after the hearing, Cale told her about Alara. Not all of it, not in the way that stories get told when they are being shared for the first time with someone who does not yet know them. He told her pieces of it, the way a person tells things when they have carried them so long that what comes out is not a narrative but a release of pressure. It happened in the record room. It had been happening there, in the evenings, with increasing frequency over the past 2 weeks. The 2 of them in the room after the rest of the keep had largely moved on to supper, and whatever else the evening contained, her working through the last sections of what had been the disorder of the archives, and him at his desk, not always working, sometimes just there. She had noticed that the being there without working had become more common in the past week. She had said nothing about it. She did not want to make it into a thing by naming it. This particular evening had started the same as the others. She had been working through a section of personal correspondence from 8 years ago that had been misfiled in the trade section and needed to be assessed for relevance before being moved. The correspondence was old enough that most of it was irrelevant, old business that had been resolved, requests for audiences that had been granted or declined years ago. She moved through it with the methodical patience she brought to everything she was unable to do quickly. Cale had been at his desk, quiet. The particular quality of his quiet that she was beginning to understand meant that his mind was somewhere else, not inattentive, but not present in the room, the way he was when he was working. He said, at some point in the later part of the evening, she used to come in here. She understood immediately who he meant. She set down the document she was holding. He said, not to work. She didn't particularly care for the records. She came because she knew I would be here and she wanted to be in the same space. She waited. He said, she was a person who managed her own time well enough that she could arrange it to include the places where the people she cared about would be. She didn't need things from those people in those moments. She just needed the proximity. She understood that too. In a different register than he'd probably imagined, she understood the logic of proximity, of wanting to be in the same acoustic space as a person, and finding that it was sufficient. She said, how long were you together? He said 4 years bonded, 2 before that, which were complicated. She said, why complicated? He said, because she was the daughter of a council family from the Eastern Territories, and I was in the middle of consolidating this kingdom, and neither of those things left much room for the other. We had long stretches of not seeing each other. We wrote. She was a much better writer than I was. She kept the letters. She said, you didn't. He said, I kept hers. She sat with that. He said, she died in winter. The 3rd winter of our bonded years. There was a sickness that moved through the Eastern Territories, and she went back to be with her family when it started, because that was who she was, and she did not come back. She said, I'm sorry. He said, it was 3 years ago now. He said it the way he always said things that had been true for a long time, with the flat acknowledgement of someone who has stopped expecting the truth to feel different than it does. Helena has never forgiven me for it. She believes I should have gone with her. She may be right. She said, you couldn't have stopped a sickness. He said, no. But I could have been there, and I wasn't. She said, why weren't you? He said, because I was managing a border dispute in the north, and I believed, which was wrong, that the eastern sickness would be contained before it became serious. I made a logistical assessment, and the logistical assessment was wrong, and she died without me there. She said nothing. He said, Helena has shaped that into a story about my priorities and what they say about me as a person. I have spent 3 years trying to determine how much of that story is true. She said, what have you concluded? He said, that some of it is true and some of it is not, and that the distinction matters less than Helena believes it does, but more than I would like. She said, that's honest. He said, I try to be. She said, I know. A moment. He said, you were going to tell me something once, when you first arrived. I asked why they left you, and you said it was a personal question for someone you'd known 30 seconds. She said, yes. He said, it's been 43 days now. She said, it has. He said nothing. She understood this as the specific kind of nothing that is actually a question. She said, his name was Nathan. We were assigned to each other 3 years ago by the Pack Council, which is how the Silverstone Pack handles bonding matches. He was the beta. I was an omega with a condition, which was how they described my blindness officially, and the reason the match had taken as long as it had was that nobody was particularly eager to take on an omega who came with what they considered to be a difficulty. She said, Nathan wasn't unkind to me, particularly. He was indifferent, which is its own kind of thing. He was not cruel the way the ceremony was cruel. The ceremony was something different from him. That was more about the Pack Council and about the optics of the situation than about him personally. What Nathan was, for 3 years, was someone I shared space with, who never quite decided I was worth knowing. He said, you deserved better than that. She said, a lot of people deserve better than what they get. That's not specific to me. He said, that doesn't make it less true in your case. She said, no. She said, The rejection itself was not the worst part. I mean that. I had known for a long time that it was coming. The worst part was the ceremony, the way it was public, the way 300 people stood in a ring and nobody said my name. Not because they all wished me harm. I don't think they all wished me harm. But because none of them had decided I was someone worth the social cost of saying my name. She said, I walked away from the bonding field that day, thinking that I was 23 years old, and I had never been somewhere where anyone had decided I was worth the social cost of saying my name. She said it plainly, not because it didn't carry weight, but because she had made her peace with it having weight. It was a fact. It was a fact that was also a wound, that had healed, in the specific way wounds heal when they are real. Not gone, but different from what they were. Cale was quiet for a long time. He said, I know your name. She said, I know you do. He said, I knew it from the moment you told it to me on the path. I have thought about it since. She said, Cale. He said, I am not going to pretend I don't know what's happening here. I have not been good at pretending for a very long time. She said, what is happening here? He said, something I did not expect and am not certain what to do with. She said, that makes two of us. He said, you've been careful. She said, I have. He said, so have I. She said, I know. She said, I have a rejection mark on my wrist. He said, I know. She said, I have no pack, no resources, no standing in this territory, and I am in your keep, because you brought me in from the border territory, and I have been useful enough to stay. He said, none of that is what I'm thinking about when I think about you. She said, what are you thinking about? He said, someone who told me I was standing in the middle of a path, someone who argued with me about my record system in the first week she was here, which no one has done in 11 years, someone who went back into a burning building to find Owen, and then found me by the sound of my breathing, in a smoke-filled corridor. He said, I think about someone who sat in a council chamber this morning and defended herself with more precision and more dignity than I see in formal proceedings conducted by people with every resource she lacks, and who, when I asked her if she was all right afterward, said yes, and meant it, because she actually was. She was quiet for a moment. The record room was very still around them, the old paper smell and the evening silence of a building at rest. She said, I've been telling myself I'm being careful. He said, I've been telling myself the same thing. She said, are we being careful? He said, probably not, at this point. She said, I have been here for 43 days. He said, yes. She said, I know this keep better than I have ever known any building I have lived in. I know where every staircase goes and how every door sounds and which window in the kitchen has the draft in the mornings. I know that Owen makes better bread on Tuesdays because the flour delivery comes Monday night and the fresh batch is always better than the stored one. I know that Vera walks the household at exactly 11 in the evening and that the pattern of her walk tells you everything about how the day went. I know that Darcy leaves a piece of fruit by my door on Wednesday mornings. She said, I know all of that. I am very good at knowing the things around me. It has kept me alive and functional in places that did not particularly want me. She said, but I don't know what to do with you. He was quiet. He said, neither do I. She said, that feels honest. He said, it is. She said, I'm not in a position to enter into anything on equal footing. I know that. You know it. It would be easy for both of us to decide the inequality makes this wrong. He said, I've thought about that. She said, what did you conclude? He said, that the inequality is real and should be acknowledged, and that acknowledging it is different from letting it be the only thing. She said, what else is there? He said, you have been the most honest person in this keep for 43 days. You have not asked for anything you were not offered. You have not manipulated anyone, including in the council chamber this morning, when manipulation would have been very easy and very effective. You have worked, consistently, at things that needed to be done, and you have done it without making it anyone's obligation to notice. He said, those are not the qualities of someone without standing. Those are the qualities I have been looking for in the people around me for 11 years. She said, you're describing a good administrator. He said, among other things. She said, Cale. He said, I know. She said, "This is not simple." He said, "No." She said, "I need some time." He said, "Take it." She said, "Not a long time. I'm not someone who benefits from long uncertainty, but some." He said, "However long you need." She said, "Don't say that. If you say things like that, you'll make it harder." He said nothing. And the nothing was, again, a presence rather than an absence, the specific presence of a man who understood what she meant and was choosing to respect it rather than argue with it. She stood up from the shelf she had been sitting beside. She felt around her for her bag, and found it, and put it over her shoulder. She found her staff against the wall. She said, "Good night." He said, "Good night." She walked to the door of the record room, and she found it by the feel of the air, changing near the door frame, and she opened it, and went out into the corridor. She stood in the hallway for a moment. The keep was quiet around her. Not the fire quiet, not the emergency quiet, not the council chamber quiet. Just the ordinary nighttime quiet of a building full of people who had decided to rest. The sound of a place at peace with itself. She stood in it, and she let herself feel, for one moment, the full weight of what she had just said, and what he had just said, and what the 43 days had built between them, without either of them deciding to build it. Then she walked to her room. She walked without counting. She turned at the right places, and her feet found the right stairs, and her hand touched the right door frame, at exactly the moment she expected it to be there, and she went inside, and sat on the edge of her bed. She sat there for a long time. She thought about Nathan's indifference, and what it had cost her over 3 years, not dramatically, not in the way of a person who is cataloging damage, just as a fact that she had lived inside. She thought about the bonding circle, and the 300 people, and the flatness of Moret's voice, and the sound of pack boots walking back through the tree line. She thought about 4 days in the borderlands and her ankle, and the berries, and the decision to walk south, because south was the only direction that made sense. She thought about 3 steps at the gate of a keep, and a man who had told her about them without being asked. She touched the rejection mark on her wrist. She held her fingertips over it for a moment. The skin was warm, as it always was. Not painfully, just warm. She thought about what warm means when it is not burning you. She lay down, and she pulled the wool blanket over herself. Not the keep's blanket, her blanket. The worn one, with the threads fraying at the corner. And she lay in the dark room, and she listened to the building around her. She was 43 days from being left at the edge of pack territory, with 2 days of food, and a rejection mark, and a twisted ankle. She was in a stone room in the Ironvale Keep, and she knew exactly where everything in that room was. She thought, "I don't know how to do this." She thought, "I am going to have to learn." She went to sleep. In the morning, the sun came through the east window, and she turned her face toward it, and she lay in it for a long time, longer than she usually did, because she thought that today she could afford to. She had a little time. She was going to use it wisely, not to be cautious, but to be sure. Not sure in the way of someone who is afraid of being wrong. Sure in the way of someone who has learned, at considerable cost, that the difference between a door you walk through because it is the only one, and a door you walk through because you have chosen it, matters more than almost anything. She wanted to be walking through a door she had chosen. She thought she almost was. She got up, she dressed, she went to the kitchen, and Owen was there, and he said nothing about the evening before, but he made her tea exactly as she liked it, and that was a kind of conversation all by itself. She sat at the kitchen table, and she held the cup in both hands, and she thought about what it meant to be known. Not accommodated, not managed, not handled carefully. Known. She had been in this keep for 43 days, and the people in it knew her. They knew the specific kind of tea she liked, and which window she sat near when she needed to think, and the particular carved bird she kept in her bag, and how she liked to be told about practical things, and not emotional ones, because she could work out the emotional ones herself. They knew she went to the kitchen when she needed to think, and that she mapped new spaces by walking their perimeters, and that she could hear the difference between a door that was open 3 inches and one that was open 6. She had not known that being known felt different from being managed until it happened to her. It was, she thought, one of the most significant discoveries of her 23 years. She drank her tea. She set down the cup. She went to find the day. The Silverstone pack arrived on the 57th morning. Lena heard the gate horn before anyone came to find her. She was in the inner courtyard, in the small stone corner she had claimed as her thinking place, and the horn was the specific double note that the gate guards used for unexpected visitors, not the single long note for known arrivals, and not the three-note pattern for formal delegations. Two notes meant unannounced and multiple. She went inside and found the second-floor hallway, which ran the length of the keep's front face, and had windows that she knew looked over the main gate, though the view was not available to her. What was available was the sound, which the hallway carried very well. She stood in the hallway, and she listened. She counted 9 voices below. She identified, by the weight of footsteps and the particular way authority distributes itself in a group, the person at the front as the one leading this delegation. The voice, when it came, was male and senior, one of the elders she recognized from the Silverstone Pack Council. She did not know his name with certainty, but she knew the voice. She had heard it at the bonding ceremony. She had heard it at the monthly pack councils that she had attended, quietly, at the back, because Omega Pack members were permitted to attend council meetings, and she had always preferred to know what was being decided, rather than hear about it secondhand. The voice told the gatekeeper that the Silverstone Pack delegation sought an audience with the King of Ironvale on a matter of importance. Garrett's voice responded from below, asking the nature of the matter. The elder said that it was a matter relating to a pack member who was believed to be in residence in the keep. Garrett said he would need to inform the king. The elder said they would wait. Lena went to the record room. She sat in the record room and she thought, very carefully, about everything she knew and everything she did not know, and what the arrival of 9 people from the Silverstone Pack was likely to mean. Cale came to the record room within 15 minutes. His footsteps were at a pace she had not heard from him before, not running, but considerably more purposeful than his normal walk. He said, "You heard." She said, "Yes." He said, 9 people. Elder council members, at least 3, based on the formality of the greeting. I don't know why. She said, "I think I might." He waited. She said, "There is something I should have told you sooner. I didn't tell you when I arrived because I didn't know it was relevant, and by the time it became potentially relevant, I had concluded that acting on the information would make me look opportunistic, and I did not want that." He said, "Tell me now." She said, "My mother's bloodline." Her mother was a woman from the far eastern territories, not from the Silverstone Pack originally. She married into it. And her family line, her specific maternal line, carries something that is uncommon enough that most people, including most people in the Silverstone Pack, did not know what it was, or that it was significant. He said, "What is it?" She said, "It's an old line, older than the current pack structures. It carries a trait that shows up rarely, sometimes one person in a generation, sometimes no one for 2 generations, and it has to do with bloodline compatibility and bonding. People from this line carry a significantly higher compatibility range than standard Omegas. It means that a bond formed with someone from this line tends to be more stable, more complete, and carries certain benefits that I won't pretend I fully understand, because the documentation on it is limited, and most of what I know came from my grandmother, who died when I was 12. He said, "And the Silverstone Pack is here because they found this out." She said, "I believe so. I knew there was something about my bloodline that my grandmother had told me was considered valuable. I did not know what specifically. I learned more from conversations I overheard in the pack over the years. I had concluded, by the time of the rejection, that the pack council did not know about the bloodline specifically, that if they had known, they would not have been as eager to be rid of me." He said, "And now they know." She said, "The timing suggests someone did research. Perhaps because of my arrival here, perhaps for an unrelated reason. If they have been in negotiations with an outside alliance, and they discovered, in the process of those negotiations, what the bloodline carries, they would have a very strong reason to want me back." He said, "Not because of you." She said, "Not because of me. No, because of what I carry, and what they could leverage through a new bond arrangement." He said, "You're telling me that your value to them has gone from something they discarded to something they now want to use." She said, "Yes." He said, "And you're telling me this now, before the audience, which gives me less time to manage the situation than if you had told me earlier." She said, "Yes, I'm sorry for that." He said, Why didn't you tell me when it became potentially relevant? She said, because I thought it might look like I was using the information to make myself more valuable to you, and I didn't want you to think I was here for strategic reasons. A pause. He said, I've never thought that. She said, I know, but I was afraid of giving you a reason to start. He said, Lena. She said, I know, I was wrong to wait, I'm telling you now. He said, I'm not angry. She said, I know that too, but the pack is at the gate, and they have 9 people, which is a formal delegation, which means they have a formal claim they intend to make, and you should know everything before you go down there. He said, are you going to come with me? She said, no. He said, I think you should. She said, I know what you think. I'm going to meet them myself. He said, that's not a negotiation you should be doing alone. She said, it's not a negotiation at all. It's a conversation I need to have. There's a difference. A silence. He said, I'll have Garrett at the gate. She said, all right. She went down, with Garrett beside her and Cale a few steps back, and she did not need to count the stairs to the main level, and she did not need anyone to tell her which corridor led to the front gate, because she had walked it 57 times. She heard the delegation before she reached the gate. 9 people, as she had counted. Their sounds had the specific quality of people who have been traveling and are trying to arrange themselves into a configuration that suggests authority. She could hear the elder at the front, and she could hear, behind him, others who were quieter, staff and escorts, the practical machinery of a formal pack visit. The gate was open. She stepped out into the morning. She could feel the position of the sun. Late morning, fairly high, coming from her left, which meant she was facing roughly south. The ground beneath her feet changed from the keep's courtyard stone to the packed earth of the approach road. She stopped walking when she was approximately 15 feet outside the gate. The elder spoke. He said, Lena Ashwood. She said, yes. He said, my name is Elder Connell. I represent the Silverstone Pack Council. She said, I know your voice, Elder Connell. You were at the bonding ceremony. A pause. He said, yes, I was. She said, what do you want? He said, there is a matter relating to your bloodline that has come to the council's attention. Information that was not known to us at the time of your rejection. We are here to discuss what that information means for your standing, and to explore the possibility of your return to the pack. She said, the pack's assessment of my value changed. He said, our understanding of your situation changed. She said, Elder Connell, I appreciate the distinction you're trying to make, and I understand why you're making it. I'm going to ask you not to. I know why you're here. I know what changed. I know that my rejection was issued under pack protocol language that makes no reference to bloodline value, because you did not know what my bloodline was worth when you used it to justify leaving me at your border with 2 days of food. She heard, very faintly, someone in the delegation shift their position. She said, I walked alone through the borderlands for 3 days after the ceremony. My ankle was injured. I had no resources. I arrived at the boundary of the Ironvale territory because I had nowhere else to go. She said, I have been here for 57 days. In that time I have worked, been useful, been treated with respect, and come to know this keep and the people in it. I have not been managed or accommodated or made to feel like a condition that requires administrative handling. She said, I am not returning to the Silverstone Pack. She said it very plainly. Connell said, you should understand that your bloodline means you have obligations that extend beyond personal preference. She said, I should understand that? He said, Pack law recognizes the responsibilities of rare bloodlines to the broader pack structure. She said, Pack law also recognizes the rights of pack members not to be publicly rejected at a bonding ceremony and left without resources at the pack boundary. I would like to know which of those laws the council finds more important. Silence. She said, I was 23 years old at that ceremony. I had been in your pack since I was 17. 6 years. I had contributed to the pack in every way that was available to me, given what you considered my limitations. I had worked in the pack kitchen, in the record keeping, in the herb processing. I had not asked for anything I was not already owed. She said, the elder who informed me of my ejection told me, in the flat voice of someone explaining a policy, that I had until midday to collect my things. I collected my things. I walked to the border, and I kept walking. She said, I did not weep. I did not beg. I did not fall apart. I walked south with what I had, and I arrived somewhere that recognized what I actually am, which is a person with considerable capability, who has been managing in places that underestimated her since she was 17 years old. She said, I am not coming back. Not for pack law. Not for bloodline obligation. Not for the council's recalculated assessment of my value. I am staying here. She heard Connell breathe. She heard, behind him, the shuffling of people who were not sure what they were supposed to do with this response. Connell said, the matter of your bloodline is not something that can simply be left unaddressed. She said, then address it here, with me, as a free agent who has not been part of your pack for 57 days, and has no intention of returning to it. If you have a legitimate claim relating to bloodline law, you can present it to the Council of Ironvale through the appropriate formal channels. I will respond to it through those channels. She said, but you are not taking me back with you today. That is not happening. Another silence. Another silence. The man who had been standing beside Connell, one of the escorts, she thought, made a sound that was almost imperceptible. She thought it was surprise. She thought it might also be something else, something closer to the specific quality of a sound that people make when they are unexpectedly moved by something they were not prepared to be moved by. Connell said, after a moment, I understand your position. She said, thank you. He said, the council will consider what approach is appropriate. She said, that is their right. He said, I want to say, and I want you to understand that I say this with full acknowledgement of the council's failure in this matter, that what was done at the ceremony was wrong. She was quiet for a moment. She said, I know. He said, it was wrong and it was done with insufficient consideration of the person involved. She said, yes. He said, I am sorry for my part in it. She considered him for a moment. She said, I believe you, Elder Connell. But believing you is separate from returning. He said, I understand. There was a moment that had nothing more to say in it. She could feel it. She said, I hope your journey back is safe. He said, thank you. And then, after a pause, you are well here. It was not a question. She thought he was reading it in the way she was standing, or in the way she had spoken, or in the specific quality of the space around her, whatever it was that people with sight read in situations like this one. She said, yes, I am. She heard the delegation begin to reorganize for departure. She turned and walked back through the gate, which she found by the change in the air's temperature where the stone walls narrowed on either side, and she walked back into the courtyard. Cale was 3 steps behind her. She had known he was there the entire time. She said, you could have spoken. He said, you didn't need me to. She said, you were going to. He said, I was ready to. You didn't need me to. She said, was I too hard on them? He said, no. She said, I wasn't soft. He said, no. You were accurate. Accurate is what that situation needed. She said, Connell is not a bad person. He said, I know. She said, he went along with something bad. Those aren't always the same person. He said, no, they're not. She stopped walking. They were in the middle of the courtyard, the open space where she could hear the fountain and the birds in the garden beyond the east wall, and the sound of the keep's daily work moving around her. She said, I told him I was staying here. He said, I heard. She said, I meant it. He said, I know. She said, I need you to know I meant it, because I chose to, not because I had no other option. The pack has offered me a return. It's not what I want, but it is an option. I am staying here because I want to stay here. That is different from before. He said, yes. She said, I'm telling you that so it's on the record between us. He said, it's on the record. She stood in the courtyard with the morning around her, and she thought about what she had said to the delegation. She had meant every word. She had not said anything for the effect of it, or for the performance of it. She had said what was true in the clearest language she had access to. She had said she was staying. She was staying. She had the specific feeling of a person who has made a decision and has now fully caught up to it. Cale said, come inside. Owen will have heard about the delegation before we get there. She said, how? He said, Owen has been in this keep for 31 years. He hears things before they happen. She said, that's not possible. He said, you'd think. She said, I'm not hungry. He said, you will be by the time we get there. She said, you don't know that. He said, you just stood at the gate and had a significant conversation with 9 people from your former pack. You're going to be hungry in approximately 10 minutes. She thought about this for a moment. She said, the timing might be off. He said, the timing is never off. She walked beside him, into the keep. She did not need the wall. She did not need to count the steps in the entrance. She walked through the north door and down the main corridor and into the kitchen, the same way she walked everywhere in this building now, with the ease of someone who knows where they are. Owen looked up when they came in. He said, I heard. She said, obviously. He said, sit down. She sat. He put bread in front of her. Fresh bread, still warm. The Tuesday bread, which was as good as Owen's bread ever got, which was very good indeed. She ate it. She was, as it turned out, hungry. Cale sat across the table and Owen moved around them, and the kitchen was warm and the morning was very nearly over, and she thought about the gate and the delegation and Elder Connell's voice saying you are well here, and she thought about the 57 days that had built between the borderland path and this kitchen table. She thought, I chose this. She thought it with the specific satisfaction of someone who has not had many occasions to think it, and is now, at last, thinking it. She ate Owen's bread, and she felt the warmth of the kitchen around her, and she did not need to count anything. She knew exactly where she was. 3 days after the delegation left, Cale came to find her in the record room. She knew it was him before the door opened. She had stopped pretending that she did not know it, to herself or to anyone else. She knew his footstep. She knew the specific quality of his presence in the air outside a room before he entered it. She knew, and she had made her peace with the knowing. She was sitting with a final set of documents, the last remaining shelf of the original disorder that had been the record room when she arrived. She had been working toward this shelf for 7 weeks. It was the oldest material in the room, some of it predating Cale's rule by 20 years, and it required the most careful handling, because age had made the paper delicate, and the information on it was sometimes the only surviving copy of certain agreements and decisions. She heard the door open. She heard him come in, and she heard him stop. She knew, from the particular quality of the stop, that he had not come to work at his desk. He had come to say something. She set down the document she was holding. She said, all right. He said, there's something I want to ask you. She said, I thought there might be. He moved to the window. She could tell by the shift in his voice's direction, the south window, the one that faced the courtyard. She knew this because she had learned the room the same way she had learned the rest of the keep, systematically and completely. He said, I have been thinking about how to say this correctly for several days. She said, that's not like you. He said, no. She said, you usually say things exactly as they come. He said, this is different. She said, say it the way it comes anyway. A pause. He said, I would like you to stay. She said, I told you I was staying. He said, I know what you said to the delegation. I know what you've said to me. I'm asking something different. She set aside the last of the documents she had been holding. She sat with her hands in her lap, and she waited. He said, I want you to stay as someone who has chosen this as her place. Not because the alternatives closed, not because leaving became too complicated, not because there is a practical advantage to remaining. I want you to stay, because this is where you want to be. He said, and I want to know, clearly, before anything else, that you understand the difference between those things, and that you are making the second choice rather than the first. She said, you heard what I said to Elder Connell. He said, I did. She said, I told him I was staying here because I wanted to stay here. I told him the pack's offer was an option, and I was not taking it. He said, yes, you said that. She said, you don't believe it. He said, I believe you meant it. I'm asking whether, when there is more at stake than a decision about whether to return to the Silverstone pack, you still mean it. She said, what's at stake? He said, what I'm asking you. She understood. She sat with it for a moment. She thought about the conversation she had needed a few days for. The thinking she had been doing since the evening in this same room, when they had sat with each other's real things, and not resolved anything, just held them in the same space. She said, "I'm going to tell you what I know. And then I'm going to tell you what I'm afraid of. And then you can decide what you want to do with both." He said, "All right." She said, "I know that I have been in this keep for 60 days, and that in those 60 days, it has become the place I know best in the world. I know that the people in it know who I am, not what my condition is, not what my status is, not what category I fit, but who I actually am. I know that I come to this record room in the mornings, not because I have been asked to, but because I want to. I know that when I go to the kitchen, Owen makes my tea without being asked. I know that Darcy leaves fruit on Wednesdays. I know that Vera walks the household at 11, and that the pattern of her walk tells you the state of the day." She said, "I know that I can navigate every staircase and every corridor in this building without counting. I know the sound of the east wing in the morning, and the inner courtyard at midday, and the kitchen at night. I know this place the way I know things I have decided to know, rather than the way I have learned to know things I am required to manage." She said, "And I know your footstep from a hallway away. I have known it for weeks." She let that sit. She said, "What I am afraid of is this. I am a rejected Omega. The mark is on my wrist. The inequality between us is real, and it cannot be entirely resolved by me telling you that I have made a choice. It is structural. It exists in the language of every pack and every territory on this continent. If I enter into something here and it ends, I end it with less than I have now, which is something, and I cannot afford less than something." She said, "I am also afraid of this. I have spent most of my life in places that managed me, that accommodated me, that decided I was a condition rather than a person. I have learned, in this keep, what it feels like to be the second thing. If I make a choice here, and the first thing comes back, if the management comes back, I will not be able to forgive myself for having walked back into it." She said, "Those are the things I am afraid of. I'm telling you because I think you should know the whole of it." He was quiet for a long moment. He said, "The inequality is real. I am not going to tell you it isn't." He said, "I am also going to tell you what I know, since you told me." She waited. He said, "I know that I have come to this record room every morning for 60 days, and that somewhere in the middle of those days I stopped coming, because it was a practical part of my routine, and started coming because you were here." He said, "I know that I sleep better since you came. Not dramatically, not in a way I could have told you about at the time, but the thing that I had been carrying, the weight of Alara and the border dispute and the year after, it has been lighter, not because you have done anything about it, because you have sat in the same room with it, and not required it to be different than it is." He said, "I know that I told you about Alara. I have not told that to anyone in this keep who did not already know it. I told you, and it did not destroy something. It changed something. Instead, in the direction I had stopped expecting things to change." He said, "And I know that you came back into a burning building for Owen, and then for me, and that you found me by my breathing in a smoke-filled corridor, and that you navigated us both out by memory, and that when I reached for your hand in the courtyard afterward, it was because I could not think of another thing to do, and I have not been able to stop thinking about it since." She was quiet. He said, "I know the mark on your wrist. I know what it means in pack law, and I know what it means socially, and I know that there are councils and elders and structures on this continent that will use it to tell a story about you that is not true. I am telling you that in my keep, the mark means what it is, which is that someone made a wrong decision 6 years in the making and executed it in a public ceremony, and I do not measure people by others' wrong decisions." He said, "I am asking you to stay because I want you here, not because you are useful, though you are. Not because this keep is better run since you arrived, though it is, because I want you here. That is the whole of it." She sat in the record room with the old paper smell around her, and the morning light that she could not see but could feel, warm on her right side where the window was, and she thought about all of it. She thought about the path in the borderland forest, the collision, the wall that turned out to have a heartbeat. She thought about 3 steps and morning sun, and bread on Tuesdays, and Owen's tea, and Darcy's fruit, and Vera's 11 o'clock walk, and Garrett's careful questions, and Simon's growing ease, and Priya's directness, and 60 days of a building, learning itself to her, and her learning herself to it. She thought about the record room, which she had been working in for 60 days, which she had now organized entirely, which was the most ordered room she had ever worked in, and which was also the room where she had spent more time in the company of this man than anywhere else, where she had told him things and heard things and sat in silences that were full rather than empty. She thought about what it would mean to make this choice freely. She thought about the fact that she knew, without question, that it was a free choice. The pack had offered her a return. She was declining it. The keep offered her work and shelter. She was not staying for those things. She was staying because she wanted to, because this place had become the place she knew, because the people in it had become her people, in the specific way that people become yours when they see you without deciding, first, what you are. She said, "What do you want this to be?" He said, "Whatever you're willing for it to be." She said, "That's not an answer." He said, "What I want is for you to be in this keep and in this life, and for that to be something that is yours as much as it is mine. What that looks like in practice, I think we should decide together." She said, "You're not going to tell me there's no rush." He said, "I was going to." She said, "Don't." He said, "All right." She said, "I don't want a long uncertainty. I know my own mind, and I've been making decisions with limited information for my whole life. I don't need more time." He said, "Then tell me." She said, "I'm going to tell you one thing first." He said, "All right." She said, "I have never been in a place where I could say the thing I actually think to the person in front of me, without calculating the cost of it first. I have been doing that here, with you. And I think you should know that that is not something I take for granted, and it is not something I am going to stop doing, and if you are asking me to be here, then you are asking me to keep doing that, which means I will say things that are difficult, and things that are inconvenient, and things that do not go easy on you, when easy is not what the situation needs." He said, "I know that." She said, "You think you know that." He said, "I know that. You told me my record system was catastrophic. You went to a council hearing and said exactly what was true, without softening it for anyone in the room, including me. You told me things in that room in the evening, about what the pack cost you, and you told them precisely, and without asking me to be careful with them." He said, "I am not looking for someone who will manage what they say to me. I spent 11 years surrounded by people who managed what they said to me. The difference since you arrived is that someone stopped." She said, "All right." He said, "All right." She said, "I'm staying." He said, "I know." She said, "I mean more than the staying I already said I was doing." He said, "I know what you mean." She said, "I want it to be clear between us." He said, "It's clear." She sat in the record room for a moment. The day was around her, the sounds of the keep moving into mid-morning, the courtyard outside, the footsteps on the upper floors, the faint sound of the kitchen beginning its midday preparations. All of it familiar, all of it hers, in the specific way that things become yours when you have decided to stay. She stood up. She found her staff against the wall where she always left it, and she picked it up, and she walked toward the window, the south window where she could feel the sun coming through the glass. She stood at the window. She said, "I'm going to finish the last shelf." He said, "I know." She said, "It will take the rest of today, and probably tomorrow." He said, "I know." She said, "And then the record room will be done." He said, "Yes." She said, "And then I'm going to start on the Eastern Archive, because Simon told me the Eastern Archive is even worse than the record room was when I started." He said, "It is." She said, "And while I'm doing that, you're going to tell me everything about the Northern trade situation, the full context, because there's something in those documents that I haven't been able to resolve without the context, and I think knowing the context will make the difference." He said, "All right." She said, "And neither of us is going to make a significant thing out of any of this on a given Tuesday, because that's not how things work between people who have decided to share a life." He said, "No." She said, "Good." She went back to the shelf. She picked up the document she had set down and she ran her fingers over it, feeling the age of it, the specific texture that came from 60-odd years of being stored in a stone room, and she thought about what she was doing, which was exactly what she had been doing for 60 days, and which was also entirely different now, and she did not need to examine the difference closely, because she had made her peace with it. She heard him sit at his desk. She heard the sound of papers being moved, and the specific sound of a pen being taken up, and then the working quiet settled around them, the familiar quiet that had been building for 60 days in this room, and she worked in it, the way she worked in everything she had decided was hers. The last shelf took the rest of the day and most of the next morning. When she finished it, she sat back, and she ran her hands over the organized, ordered surface of the final section, and she thought about what it had been when she arrived, and what it was now, and she allowed herself, briefly, the particular satisfaction of work that is done well, and done completely. She did not announce that the shelf was finished. She stood up, and she put the last document in its place, and she took her bag and her staff, and she walked to the door. In the doorway she stopped. She reached out to her right, where the doorframe was, and she put her hand on the wood. She had mapped this doorframe on her second day. She had found it in the dark, in a room she did not yet know, and she had filed it and remembered it, and by the 10th day she had stopped needing to reach for it, because she knew exactly where it was. She held her hand on it for a moment. Then she let it go, and she walked out into the corridor, and she did not need to reach for the doorframe because she already knew where it was. She walked through the keep that she had made her own. She passed the second staircase and turned at the landing she had memorized in the first week, and went down the hall that led to the kitchen corridor. And she found the kitchen by smell, before she found it by sound, and Owen was there. He looked up. She said, "The record room is done." He said, "Good." And then he said, "Sit down." She sat. He made her tea without being asked, and he put it in front of her, in the way he always put things in front of her, from the right, at the near edge of the table, so she would not need to search for it. She held the cup in both hands. The kitchen was warm. The morning light was coming through the window that had the draft, the east kitchen window, the one that leaked slightly in winter, and that Owen had complained about for 3 years, without getting it fixed because he had decided the draft was useful in summer, and the inconvenience in winter was a reasonable price. She sat in it, and she thought about 60 days that had built something she had not known was being built until it was built, and she thought about the record room behind her, finished, organized, every document in its place, with logic behind the placement, and she thought about the doorframe. She thought, "I have known where that doorframe was for 58 days, and today I finally stopped reaching for it." She thought, "That is what belonging feels like." She drank her tea. Later that afternoon, Cale came to find her in the inner courtyard, her thinking corner, the small stone place, where she had been sitting on difficult mornings since the second week. He sat beside her, which he had not done before in this specific corner, and he was quiet for a while, in the way that he was quiet when things were settled rather than unresolved. After a while, Darcy came through the courtyard on her way to somewhere, and she stopped when she saw them, and Lena could hear in the quality of her stop the specific sound of a person who has found exactly what they hope to find, and is trying not to make too much of it. Darcy said, in a voice that was doing a great deal of work to be casual, "I left fruit on Wednesday. I wasn't sure you'd noticed." Lena said, "I always notice." Darcy said, "Good," and then she kept walking. Lena could hear her getting further away down the courtyard path, and at the very edge of hearing range, she thought she caught the sound of Darcy making a small, pleased, compressed sound that might have been a laugh. Lena sat in the courtyard, and the afternoon moved around her, and the keep breathed its ordinary sounds, and she thought about nothing specific for a while. She thought about what it meant to be somewhere you had decided to be. She thought about the fact that she had been offered a return to the only pack she had ever known, and she had stood at the gate of this keep and declined it without hesitation, because her feet on this courtyard stone were more familiar than her feet on any surface she had stood on in the Silverstone Pack's territory. She had been here 60 days. She had been in the Silverstone Pack for 6 years. It was not, she thought, really a question of time. She reached into her bag, and she found the small carved bird that Darcy had given her, the cedar one, worn smooth at the edges from weeks of being carried. She turned it over in her fingers. She thought about the woman who had walked into the borderlands with a twisted ankle and 2 days of food and a folding knife that had belonged to her father, and she thought about who that woman had been, which was someone who had decided, very quietly and without announcing it, that she was not going to let what had happened to her define the direction she walked. She had walked south. She had walked directly into something she could not see, and could not have planned, and could not have chosen in advance. She thought, I did not choose this. And then, but I am choosing it now. And those were, she had learned, very different things. She put the bird back in her bag. She stood up from her corner of the courtyard. She found the path to the north door, by the change in the surface under her feet, and she walked toward it. And she did not count the steps, and she did not need to. She went inside. She went home.